About 1 month after Star Wars Andor aired its series finale, a clip of creator Tony Gilroy on the New York Times podcast Interesting Times began circulating online. In the clip, host and self-identified Catholic conservative Ross Douthat repeatedly tried to argue that Andor, a show about revolutionaries resisting a fascist empire, is a leftist work of art that he, as a conservative, disagreed with, but still admired.
He makes art that I consider left-wing, and also quite brilliant.
But despite Douthat's praise, Gilroy rejected the framing of Andor as a leftist work of art, arguing that he himself never thought about the show as leftist, or, hell, even all that particularly oppositional to Douthat's conservative worldview.
But I think you've made a left-wing work of art. What do you think?
I never think about it that way. It was never, I never do. I don't,
But it's a story, but it's a political story about
do you
revolutionary...
identify with the empire? Do you identify with the empire?
No, I don't. But I don't think that you have to be left-wing to resist authoritarianism, right? But I see the...
Ross was clearly confused by Tony Gilroy's response, which is a state that conservative pundits increasingly enter into whenever a thought lasts longer than a soundbite nowadays.
I like your funny words, Magic Man.
But even then, the clip also unsettled many on the American political left as well. I mean, after all, Andor has been embraced by many on the American left as one of the most inspirational mainstream anti-fascist works of art in recent years, especially amid what many see as America's accelerating slide into fascism. The show's imagery and slogans have appeared regularly at anti-Trump protests. People constantly compare clips from the show to real-world events in the United States, such as contrasting Senator Mon Mothma's outspoken speech against genocide.
What happened yesterday on Goldman was unprovoked genocide.
With the silence and half measures from Democrats on Israel's genocide of Palestinians.
Do you believe what Israel's doing in Gaza is a genocide?
Look, the bottom line is that we must do much, much more to get food to the Gazans. We must do much, much more to see that they get relief. And the Trump administration should be doing more in that regard as well.
An allegorical reading that Gilroy himself says he didn't intend with the show, but openly supports. Protesters even read a speech from Andor at anti-ICE demonstrations in the United States after the ICE killings of Alex Preddy and Renee Good in 2026.
Remember that the frontier of the rebellion is everywhere, and even the smallest act of resistance pushes our lines forward.
And on top of this, Andor wasn't even the only Hollywood project this year that seemed to strike a nerve with American leftists. Earlier in 2025, leftists celebrated James Gunn's big tentpole cinematic launch of the new DC Comics film franchise, Superman, for featuring an anti-imperialistic storyline that many read through an allegorical lens of Ukraine and Gaza, complete with Hawkgirl herself straight up killing an authoritarian asshole that many read as an allegory for Putin or Netanyahu. Frankly, we could use more Hawkgirls in real life.
I know you won't kill me! You are too delicate and weak, like Superman!
I'm not like Superman.
But even outside of genre works, Paul Thomas Anderson's One Battle After Another, a film that directly evokes the Black Panthers and other anti-American imperialist movements for its protagonists, was not only championed by self-proclaimed leftists as a great film, but the film industry itself in Hollywood, with it breaking SAG nomination records, winning the Golden Globe for Best Musical or Comedy, and getting 13 Oscar nominations, ultimately winning 6 of them, including Best Picture and Best Director for Paul Thomas Anderson.
Our film obviously has a certain amount of parallels to what's happening in the news every day. So it obviously reflects what's happening in the world. In terms of where it's going, I don't know, but I know that the end of our movie is our hero, Willa, heading off to continue to fight against evil forces. And I think, like I said in my speech, bring at least common sense and decency back into fashion.
Perhaps all this was signaling that the workers' revolution really could be televised. Or, at the very least, that it was seeping into the mainstream American consciousness. Yet, as recently as December 2025, Gilroy reiterated that he didn't see Andor as leftist.
reasons.
Yeah, well, he was
that the
trying
empire's gone
that
too
was
far.
an interesting interview because he was really trying to pin the show down and pin me down into a I mean,
a left-right
in a
dichotomy,
way,
kind of.
but certainly put it in a place where I didn't feel comfortable it should go. It really came around from him trying to push me into a left-right definition of the show, and I don't see the show in that context. I mean, I know what my politics are, and they're certainly left.
But strangely, even as a self-described leftist anarchist myself, who has spent an alarming number of hours on this channel praising and analyzing Andor to the point where people probably assume that it's my kink, because it is, I think Gilroy is right. Andor, along with many of the aforementioned works, isn't actually leftist. And I think it's really important that we look at why these stories get labeled leftist here in America, because I think it will show how narrow American political imagination has become, especially among the left. Decades of liberal state myth-making, echoed through corporate cultural machines like Hollywood, have bound our sense of what revolutionary praxis actually means. Because again and again, Hollywood takes the language and aesthetic of revolution and secretly folds it safely back into the status quo, teaching us not only to not imagine new worlds, but also to mistake their absence for inevitability. Hollywood-funded media has spent decades portraying resistance movements led by oppressed people as inherently dangerous. Not because their cause is unjust, mind you, but because their motivations are framed as about revenge.
I shall have such revenges on you.
The constant implication is that oppressed people don't fight to dismantle the hierarchy that oppressed them, but to flip it, so as to become the same tyrants that they once resisted, powered by a vengeance-distorted version of justice. You have the Flag Smashers in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Killmonger in Black Panther, the Hellions in Doctor Who, the Changelings in Star Trek Picard, Denzel Washington in Gladiator 2. I could keep going, and these are just examples from just the past few years.
We were given the power to change our world, and you chose to destroy it. Just like Sentinel, you have betrayed Cybertron and its citizens. And you betrayed me.
Now, to be fair, there is precedent for these depictions. There have been movements born from oppression that turn towards exclusionary or supremacist politics. The Nation of Islam is one complicated example. Zionist movement's weaponization of Jewish Holocaust trauma to justify the creation of an Israeli state built on the ideological foundation of the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians is another. These histories, I believe, deserve serious contextual examination, even within allegorical stories like the ones I'm describing, considering that they often have deeply nuanced and specific causes for their supremacist ideology, as well as acknowledging how some colonial powers enable some of these movements while crushing others. Again, see British and America's historical and ongoing support of Israel. But instead of doing that, Hollywood nearly ubiquitously reduces these types of movements to oversimplified, revenge-obsessed extremists, reinforcing the idea that liberation would only produce chaos and bloodshed, and an even worse status quo.
It was supposed to be a stopgap. A drug that our kind was hooked on that we could give up like a child, casting away their toys. A place to indulge ourselves with the humans. It's been years. And still, We can't get enough.
Reflecting the same flattening logic used in Western media depictions of real-world liberation movements. Like how much of Western news media, most especially American and Israeli news media, has portrayed Palestinian resistance for decades as simply only wishing to oppress or kill all the Jews, rather than seeking Palestinian liberation and self-determination, and then using that portrayal as ultimately justification for Israel's genocidal actions against Palestinians. But more importantly, we need to acknowledge that these are not actually the dominant story of resistance, despite their overabundance in Hollywood depictions. Most anti-colonial liberatory struggles, fractured as they can be, primarily fight for survival, autonomy, and self-determination, not domination and revenge. And while violence caused by these movements can at times reach civilians, it is most often shaped by the logic of self-defense and resistance to systemic oppression, not the apocalyptic mass slaughter that Hollywood imagines happens the second anyone reads Franz Fanon for the first time. But these Hollywood depictions conveniently often justify preserving the status quo of power. When a story does treat these resistance groups' grievances, if not their revenge-fueled methods and goals, as legitimate, the protagonist of the film, who is usually not part of these movements, usually absorbs them and turns them into a push for civil and liberal reform, with the stories ultimately affirming the trust in the civility of institutions and the rule of law to expand freedoms when confronted with a show of moral clarity.
You've got to do better, Senator. You've got to step up.
Which, historically, is about as reliable as a billionaire promising that they just need one more tax break to fix everything. This is a familiar trope that I've talked about numerous times before on this channel, and many of us can recognize it by now. So much so that if you say systemic change 3 times in the mirror, the ghost of Kevin Feige appears to give a lecture about working within the system. The few times that we do get more sympathetic portrayals of militant revolutionaries, they tend to be limited to movements that remain culturally legible to American audiences. Individual Irish terrorists, like those fighting for libertarian groups like the IRA, have often filled the role of what you might call the gentleman terrorist. Their militancy is often contextualized and humanized in films like Michael Collins or Belfast, in ways that allow the audience to see them as legitimate political actors with real grievances, rather than irrational, angry extremists out for revenge.
I did wade through rivers of blood. Huh?
And whose blood do you think he's talking about? Yours, Mick.
Will you marry me? Yeah?
Yeah.
But this is in large part because Irish identity has, in recent decades, been folded into whiteness, something that the leftist cooks explored in their own beautiful video on the subject that I highly recommend you go watch. But even then, these films portray groups like the IRA themselves as extremist and dangerous, while only humanizing the individual terrorist, all while framing British state violence as just an inevitable force of nature, rather than a systemic choice made and maintained by a nation-state.
They can jail us. They can shoot us. They can even conscript us. They can use us as cannon fodder in the Somme. But we have a weapon more powerful than any in the whole arsenal of their British Empire. And that weapon is our refusal.
But that sympathy for the individual terrorist does not extend to contemporary racialized struggles that run counter to American political interests today. Take how Hollywood has continued to refuse to distribute an Oscar-winning Palestinian documentary like No Other Land, and continues to blacklist performers who speak out against Israeli policy, and still routinely portrays Arab resistance movements as stock terrorists. And all that's if Hollywood will acknowledge non-white resistances at all. See how there's nearly a complete absence of representation of contemporary and historical indigenous American resistance movements, with Hollywood instead gravitating today towards narratives that center on indigenous suffering, like Killers of the Flower Moon, for example. While in the past, indigenous resistance to colonial expansion into their territory was often used as the stock villain in many of America's mythologizing Western films, today's stories about the suffering that indigenous people endured often is meant to elicit sympathy for these groups, while quietly reassuring audiences that those injustices belong to the past and have supposedly been resolved through liberal civility. That illusion gets reinforced through the celebration of indigenous actors like Lily Gladstone, who has been rewarded by the Hollywood machine, even as the industry and broader culture itself continue to sidestep the ongoing disenfranchisement and violence against indigenous communities.
They had the nerve to put together this little PowerPoint of all the reasons why they won't search. And I didn't see one point on there saying why they should. There wasn't a single point. And it was basically to say, we failed you and we're not going to do anything.
And all of this is the same industry, mind you, that in 1973 absolutely vilified Apache activist Shasheen Littlefeather for delivering a 60-second speech at the Oscars about the mistreatment of indigenous peoples.
He very regretfully cannot accept this very generous award. And the reasons for this being are the treatment of American Indians today by the film industry, and on television in movie reruns, and also with recent happenings at Wounded Knee. I beg at this time that I have not intruded upon this evening, and that we will, in the future, our hearts and our understandings will meet with love and generosity. Thank you on behalf of Marlon Brando.
All of this is absolutely not new for the Hollywood industry, as it has a long history of targeting those who speak out against settler colonialism that America is complicit in. Take actress Vanessa Redgrave, who gave an amazing speech at the 1978 Oscars calling out Zionist hoodlums after the Jewish Defense League had threatened the Academy if they voted for her to win the Oscar, after she sold 2 of her houses to help fund the documentary The Palestinian, which she also narrated.
And you have refused to be intimidated by the threats of a small bunch of Zionist hoodlums whose behavior is an insult to the stature of Jews all over the world and to their great and heroic record of struggle against fascism and oppression.
After giving that speech at the Oscars, she was essentially blacklisted from the industry for decades. Hollywood may occasionally experiment with sympathetic revolutionaries as individuals, but it consistently draws firm lines around whose resistance is treated as complex and whose gets erased or villainized. To speedrun over a century of Hollywood history here, much of what we now think of as normal studio storytelling is the result of sustained pressure from American state power, corporate interests, and religious institutions working overtime to bring the film industry in line with dominant political and moral norms. During the Red Scare and the rise of McCarthyism in the 1940s and 50s, for example, Hollywood was openly policed by the House Un-American Activities Committee, leading to the blacklisting of writers, directors, and actors suspected of leftist politics in Hollywood.
In July 1934, an editorial in the Commonweal, a semi-official organ of the Catholic Church, declared that the muck merchants of Hollywood, that fortress of filth that had been destroying the moral fiber of the American people, had finally been brought to its knees by the Catholic Church and its legion of decency. In less than a year, the Church had recruited millions of Americans of all religious denominations to pledge not to attend immoral movies. With the national depression already threatening Hollywood's financial stability, movie czar Will Hays, head of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, accepted the terms of surrender dictated by the Church and its legions.
We had an entire generation of creators who had been exploring labor struggle, collective action, and social critique within Hollywood be pushed right out of the industry. The Hays Code was established in the 1930s after numerous scandals in the Hollywood industry led to backlash from religious groups, and led to, ultimately, the code rigidly enforcing an American-centric morality that erased the up-till then nuanced portrayals of queer people in Hollywood by mandating that queer characters be punished or pathologized. And it also forced films to present law enforcement and state authority as fundamentally righteous and only allowing the occasional bad apples who had to be shown to be morally condemned by the narrative by the end. The code also restricted depictions of interracial relationships and heavily policed portrayals of black life, ultimately reinforcing white supremacist social order through what stories could safely be told. Taken all together, and again, I am oversimplifying and speedrunning so much here, this history of reactionary policing didn't just censor individual films within Hollywood, but reshaped the DNA of the Hollywood industry itself, creating storytelling traditions that still uphold state legitimacy and punish deviancy, and ultimately work to sanitize visions of American power in ways that still echo through mainstream media storytelling today, all like a cultural muscle memory. And all of this history is exactly why one battle after another feels, at first blush, a little startling for this industry. The protagonists of Paul Thomas Anderson's film belong to a fictional militant group called the French 75, which openly carries out attacks against American military and capitalist institutions. Meanwhile, the film's primary antagonists are a white supremacist organization known as the Christmas Adventurers Club, which, by the way, is perfectly in line with the level of stupid white supremacist naming conventions that we've seen throughout the years. It's right up there with Grand Dragon. I have no notes on that. And the Adventurers Club's members are drawn from military, economic, and political power in the United States, making them function clearly as a narrative stand-in for the white supremacy that is woven through American institutional power itself.
Now, our aim and your aim is the same: to find dangerous lunatics, haters, and punk trash, and stop them. No more lunatics.
And unlike the usual Hollywood formula, the French 75's use of violence against American imperial power and institutions is presented as, at least narratively, a legitimate political response to the violence done against people within America. That's a pretty radical portrayal for a Warner Brothers funded film in an industry that spent most of its entire history portraying revolutionary organizing as a threat. The film itself feels like it's directly responding to a growing hunger for stories that move beyond reformist fantasies where a conventionally attractive hero with 1,000 faces gives an inspiring speech which mystically fixes centuries worth of structural violence.
So no matter what type of animal you are, from the biggest elephant to our first fox, I implore you, try. Try to make the world a better place. Look inside yourself and recognize that change starts with you. It starts with me. It starts with all of us.
But if we begin to scratch a little bit beneath that surface, we can see it gets a little bit more insidious. The biggest thing to note is that while the film asks us to sympathize with the French 75, it never actually lets them articulate a coherent political project beyond wanting to tear down American institutions. And the motivations for their actions often come across as rather aimless. For example, we see them attempting to blow up a government building at one point in the story, but we're never really shown what their goal was with this bombing, beyond just causing a vague sense of chaos like they're the Heath Ledger Joker.
I'm the Joker, baby!
All that's not to say that the French 75 don't have tangible results that we see in the film. The movie opens up with a sequence of the 75 freeing immigrants from an American detention camp, clearly evoking the migrants in cages imagery that became a galvanizing political issue during the Trump administration's first term, and an image that still resonates today, especially amid the ICE crackdowns during Trump's second term. And this sequence is clearly structured to make even skeptical liberal viewers sympathize with the revolutionaries' more violent tactics by anchoring them to political goals that overlap with mainstream liberal talking points, like rescuing migrants from brutal and dehumanizing immigrant detention.
They separated them at the border to make it a disincentive to come to begin with. Bay, real tough, we're really strong. And guess what? They cannot, it's not coyotes didn't bring them over, their parents were with them. They got separated from their parents, and it makes us a laughingstock and violates every notion of who we are as a nation.
But during this sequence, the film never truly slows down to humanize the freed migrants at any point. Instead, their liberation fades into the background of the open action spectacle of the film, becoming entertainment for us, the viewers, and seemingly for the characters as well. Our French 75 heroes set off fireworks as a getaway distraction while having sex after this, and they never stopped to check whether the migrants were actually safe. As a result, the scene begins to characterize the French 75 as motivated less by political purpose than by aimless, adrenaline-fueled, rebellious thrill-seeking.
This is what power looks like. This is the fun. The guns is the fucking fun.
And again, it's worth saying, like the fact that supremacist revolutionary groups do exist, there is some truth to the performative nature of certain leftist groups. But the film flattens important, crucial distinctions of these revolutionary movements that it is intentionally aesthetically evoking. For example, the black-led French 75 very deliberately pulls from the visual language of groups like the Black Panthers and the Black Liberation Front, like in how Perfidia, one of the early protagonists of the movie, wears khakis and boots while firing a machine gun.
Guns is the fucking fun!
Very clearly evoking the image of Black Panthers patrolling Oakland neighborhoods to monitor police activity, an image which became the defining cultural idea of the Panthers for white America. But it's really important to note that that image becoming the entire cultural understanding of the Black Panthers wasn't accidental. The FBI's COINTELPRO campaign against the Black Panthers actively constructed and cultivated that image because they wanted to portray the Panthers as violent criminals while at the same time erasing the reality that the Panthers were organizing armed self-defense in response to repeated state-sanctioned police violence against Black communities.
The national director of the FBI said that the Black Panther Party was the #1 threat to national security of this nation.
More importantly, America often erases the history of how the Panthers confronted a state killing their community not only through armed resistance against the police, but by stepping in to provide food, healthcare, and support within Black communities in ways that the state refused to do.
As a community worker, I attended many Black Panther Party functions. I was part of the breakfast program. We registered many people, the African American community and others, to vote.
They created free breakfast programs, education initiatives, and community health clinics. And Black Panther leaders like Huey P. Newton regularly also advocated for solidarity with similar queer, migrant, and women's liberatory groups in the United States.
They definitely have a place in the revolutionary movement, the Women's Liberation Front. The Women's Liberation Front, some of the groups are politically conscious. Those groups of women who are politically conscious, we would like to unite with them, and we would like to also have unity with the homosexual groups who are also politically conscious.
Ultimately, the Black Panthers' goal was to create what political theorists call dual power. They desired to build alternative systems of survival and governance alongside the state, demonstrating that communities could meet their own needs without relying on the state institutions that had historically met them with violence, neglect, or surveillance. Contrast this with the French 75 in One Battle After the Other. The film goes out of its way to portray its revolutionaries as comically disorganized.
There are no hands on the clock.
Why?
Because they're not needed.
What time is it?
Fuck. You know, I don't remember that part. All right, let's just not nitpick over the password stuff. Look, this is Bob Ferguson. All right, you just called my house. Let's cut the shit. I need the rendezvous point.
What time is it?
In the back half of the film, after a 16-year time jump, we find the French 75 in total disarray, while good old Leonardo DiCaprio is just sitting around getting high in his bathrobe. There's also a running gag where Leo can't remember an absurdly complicated passcode, and when he finally snaps in frustration at his contact, the contact responds by saying,
"Okay, this doesn't feel safe. You're violating my space right now."
Violating your space? Man, come on, what kind of revolutionary are you, brother? We're not even in the same room here. We're talking on the phone, like men.
Okay, there's no need to shout. This is a violation of my safety. These are noise triggers.
Fucking noise trigger, listen.
It's a deeply cringy meme understanding of leftist revolutionary groups, built on the propagandized perception of them as performative and deeply unserious, rather than as disciplined, community-rooted organizers like the Black Panthers were. I mean, it's not an accident that this movie won the Golden Globe for Best Comedy, not Best Drama.
They say that winning Best Picture, it tells the temper of our times. So how does this one reflect where we are or where we're going in society?
I thought we were supposed to be partying.
And this is a much broader Hollywood trope. Take Edgar Wright's recent adaptation of Stephen King's The Running Man. Not the Schwarzenegger one, the one that I know you didn't see.
I'll be back. Only in a rerun.
That movie follows Ben, a working class man surviving under an authoritarian media regime who enters a deadly game show in order to pay for his baby's health care. As he continues to survive in the show, he slowly becomes a symbol of resistance to the people watching. But Ben himself doesn't seek to dismantle the system, he just wants to survive it long enough so that he can pay for his baby's health care.
I'm not the initiator. I'm a guy trying to get back to his family.
The actual revolutionary voice in the film comes through Michael Cera's character, Elton Perkins, who is explicitly shown to be an anarchist in the movie.
Normal, non-revolutionary literature.
Who hopes to use Ben's fame in order to spark a mass revolt, planning to release anarchist pamphlets in conjunction with Ben's moves against the media empire.
A bomb's chemicals hold great power, but without an initiator to make it go boom, it's harmless. You know why they cheered for you down there? They think you just might win. And if you can survive against those goons, so can they. The people have had it. This country's ready to blow. and you're the initiator.
This plotline clearly reflects real-life anarchists like Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman, who in 1892 attempted to assassinate Henry Clay Frick, the Carnegie Steel executive who had hired Pinkertons to violently suppress the Homestead strike, believing that the act would function as an entente, a public act of political violence meant to awaken latent revolutionary consciousness in the working class and spark a broader revolt against capitalism. As well as the 1918 arrest and eventual Supreme Court conviction of 6 anarchists, including Molly Steimer and Jacob Abrams, for distributing anti-war, anti-state pamphlets during World War I, which authorities prosecuted under the Sedition Act of 1918 that criminalized criticism of the government. These two events were clearly led by anarchists whose actions were motivated by extremely clear political goals, rather than aimless thrill-seeking. In fact, during her trial before the Supreme Court, Molly Steimer gave perhaps the best definition of anarchism ever articulated within the US judicial system.
By anarchism, I understand a new social order, where no group of people shall be governed by another group of people. Individual freedom shall prevail in the full sense of the word. Private ownership shall be abolished. Every person shall have an equal opportunity to develop himself well, both mentally and physically. We shall not have to struggle for our daily existence as we do now. No one shall live on the product of others. Every person shall produce as much as he can, and enjoy as much as he needs, receive according to his need. Instead of striving to get money, we shall strive towards education, towards knowledge. While at present the people of the world are divided into various groups, calling themselves nations, while one nation defies another, in most cases considers the others as competitive. We, the workers of the world, shall stretch out our hands towards each other with brotherly love. To the fulfillment of this idea I shall devote all my energy, and if necessary, render my life for it.
I want you to keep in mind that the girl was literally 20 years old when she said that in front of the entire US Supreme Court. Fucking badass. Yet despite clearly evoking real anarchist history led by activists who engaged in targeted political violence as part of organized ideological movements, the film reduces that legacy to Michael Cera's character being portrayed as motivated purely by grievance-fueled thrill-seeking and ultimately treated as a punchline rather than someone acting with political purpose. With continual jokes about him having an overbearing mother who dominates him and he's just a cuck, and a sequence where he literally makes Ben run in circles during a raid against his house just so he can set off Home Alone-style traps for fun instead of trying to save Ben's life.
You brought us up here so you could slide down a pole?
I brought us up here so we could slide down a pole!
Ultimately, Michael Cera dies trying to save Ben, and Ben, at the end of the movie, does spark a workers' revolution, but one that focuses on destroying the network and fulfilling Ben's personal revenge on Josh Brolin, the head of the network. Something that the film wants us to sympathize with, but which still frames revolution as solely about revenge and without any larger political goals. Though I will say, despite all of this, The Running Man's biggest sin is that it put Lee Pace in a mask for 95% of the movie's runtime. You don't do that to my hot elf boy. At least Foundation and Invincible are out here giving me my regular intake of Lee Pace. You can also look at movies like V for Vendetta. In the comic book, the main character V is an expressed anarchist in ways that reflect author Alan Moore's own political views. But the movie just turns V into a nebulous anti-authoritarian fight the system kind of guy, without any larger political project beyond just defeating the fascist government.
There is something terribly wrong with this country, isn't there? Cruelty and injustice, intolerance and oppression. And where once you had the freedom to object, to think and speak as you saw fit, you now have censors and systems of surveillance coercing your conformity and soliciting your submission.
We need cameras.
How did this happen? Who's to blame?
All of this reflects how mainstream media tends to portray decentralized grassroots community movements. Take the Occupy Wall Street movement in the early 2010s. Most media and political commentators mocked Occupy as comical and politically incoherent.
I'm here fighting for a society where everyone has access to the goods of life.
Would you share your iPad too with one of those shiftless hobos down in Bumtown?
No, but I do think we should live in a society where everyone has access to technology and goods that everyone can use.
So it's not so much about sharing, it's about everybody having an iPad too.
Or at least everybody having access to the material wealth of life.
Okay,
not just a few people.
Except for yours.
Well, it's a personal possession. I'm more against private property, not personal property.
Despite the movement itself having a very coherent political ideology, it was clearly organized under anarchist David Graeber's concepts of decentralized direct democratic organizing.
After a little bit of uncertainty, we sort of started putting together a process. We decided to model on the idea of the sort of horizontal direct democracy they had in Europe. And in a way, the Wall Street action was one focus, but the very idea of building that kind of General Assembly movement was a lot of what we were really about. The idea is that, all of the political parties have basically bankrupted themselves. They're all essentially bought and sold by the financial elite that's created this crisis. There's no possibility of their actually coming up with a solution. And essentially, you have to start over. People have to go into their public squares, meet each other, start talking to each other, and start brainstorming of ideas. I mean, essentially, the idea is the system is not going to save us. We're going to have to save ourselves. So we're going to try to get as many people as possible to camp in some public place and start rebuilding society as we'd like to see it.
Again, this isn't to say that revolutionary disorganization isn't grounded in some reality. There are many revolutionary groups that are deeply, deeply disorganized. In fact, going back to it, one battle after another also evokes the Weather Underground, which was a predominantly white Marxist group in the 1970s whose tactics mirror the French 75, such as how they would leave bombs in random places to target their political enemies, or botched a Brinks truck robbery leading to the death of 2 policemen and a civilian truck driver. As author Brooke Obie points out, black radical figures such as Fred Hampton, the Black Panthers' deputy chairman, strongly criticize these tactics as reckless and reactive rather than proactive.
We stand way back from the SDS and the Weatherman. They call them both national action. We think that RIM 2 is national action, Weatherman is national reaction, We think it is anarchistic, opportunistic, individualistic, it's chauvinistic, it's custoristic, and that's the bad part about it. It's custoristic in that its leaders take people into situations where the people can be massacred, and they call that revolution. And it's nothing but child's play, it's folly, and it's criminal because people can be hurt. We say that they're doing exactly what the pigs want them to do. When they take people down and just do nothing, play around, and the pigs are prepared for this, and they'll wipe all of those young people out. We think these people may be sincere, but they're misguided, they're muddleheads, and they're scatterbrains. The only way we can show them is to criticize them like we're doing right now, and then leave from here and go to the federal building and have a demonstration that's to educate, a demonstration that is disciplined and organized, and that's what we're going to have to do, and let them see the examples.
All this mirrors how the French 75 themselves are depicted. But the problem is how one battle after another flattens that history. The film draws on the state-produced cultural image of the Black Panthers as chaotic, violent militants, while also blurring them together with more disorganized groups. And in doing so, it echoes decades of propaganda meant to erase the very infrastructure that made the Black Panthers a genuine threat to American state power in the first place. So, one battle after another reinforces that myth that all homegrown leftist movements are doomed to collapse under their own chaos, while ignoring the actual history that it is intentionally evoking of groups that didn't do that. The one exception to this, in the film that we get, is through Benicio del Toro's character Sensei. Shout out, by the way, to Elliot Sang, whose criticism I'm echoing here, but there's a really compelling sequence in the movie where we follow Leonardo DiCaprio awkwardly wandering around trying to find a phone charger, while Sensei, instead, moves through his community coordinating resistance to the military presence in the city in order to protect the undocumented immigrant network that he's been helping run. And while it's cool that the film portrays a Hispanic-led revolutionary group as incredibly organized and competent, the film presents this group less like real people and more like a perfectly functioning revolutionary machine, in a way that echoes a long tradition of mainly white, disorganized leftist spaces romanticizing indigenous resistance movements as flawless and unified, ignoring many of their own internal struggles, political disagreements, and complexities. And that kind of romanticization can easily reproduce racist dynamics by saying, oh, they've got themselves, they're doing great, we're the ones that are disorganized and need to get our shit together, and we don't really need to go out of our way to help Hispanic folks because they have got themselves. So the film contrasting this idealized indigenous organizing with a flattened portrayal of American activism as chaotic and ineffective, while at the same time erasing the very real and still impactful histories of groups like the Black Panthers, results in a narrative that implies that much of what white Americans have is credited to liberal institutions that cause social progress, while indigenous resistance groups fighting for their own autonomy have got themselves, and that we should admire them, but not collaborate with, learn from, or build solidarity alongside them in any real way. And all of this is especially troubling in conjunction with the film's handling of the character Perfidia Beverly Hills, one of the leaders of the French 75.
We planted a bomb at the Haymarket office of your re-election campaign. We warned you that abortion ban and you didn't want to fucking listen. So, for my sisters in need, we will strike. Sincerely yours, Perfidia Beverly Hills, motherfucker.
We first meet Perfidia at the beginning of the movie where she's freeing detained immigrants. And during that sequence, Perfidia sexually humiliates the commander of the detention facility, Colonel Stephen Lockjaw, in order to distract him. But at the same time, the scene implies that Perfidia takes a certain pleasure in holding sexual power over Lockjaw. Very shortly thereafter in the narrative, Lockjaw captures her and ultimately blackmails her into sleeping with him so she can avoid being arrested, an act of rape that results in her getting pregnant. This narrative, by the way, echoes the real-life history of sexual violence used against black women slaves as a tool of control by slave owners, abuse that often produced children whose parentage mothers could not safely acknowledge for fear of violence. Which is also, by the way, reflected in the movie when Lockjaw later attempts to kill his own daughter as her existence threatens his chance to join the White Boy Christmas Club.
There's an unconfirmed report that Colonel Stephen J. Lockjaw is the father of a mixed-race child. Which mix? There's no real easy way to say this, but yeah, it's black.
It also reflects how many white supremacists still fetishize marginalized people that they seek to dominate, like black women or trans people. Western culture has a long history of fetishizing black women's body types, especially features like larger buttocks and hips, going all the way back to the exploitation and display of Sarah Bartman. And it's this same visual fixation both Lockjaw and One Battle After Another's own camera falls into, with the camera having us take on the viewpoint of Lockjaw as he leers at Perfidia's body, and specifically her ass, all while the movie never gives us a real sense of Perfidia's own internal life. Yet, I've seen that some viewers have read Lockjaw and Perfidia's relationship as a sort of twisted, fucked up romance, one where Perfidia is certainly being assaulted, but has some level of desire for Lockjaw in these scenes, instead of an echo of the long history of sexual violence of black women in America that it is. And while that is a fucked up reading that I don't think the film intends, I don't think that it's entirely the audience's fault either. Because if you watch the movie, the camera constantly fetishizes Perfidia and objectifies her body, and rarely ever gives us access to her internal life, instead aligning us more with Leonardo DiCaprio or Lockjaw's gaze upon her instead of her perspective. Then, the film goes to sequences where Perfidia refuses to give up fighting for the revolution in order to stay back home with Leonardo DiCaprio in a domestic parenthood fantasy.
Where are you going right now?
Stop talking to me. Now go as I please.
You realize that we're a family now, right? You don't have to do this anymore.
You realize I put myself first, right? And that's what you're scared of.
We have her now. You do get that, right?
I put myself first and I reject your lack of originality.
God, my lack of originality. Would you stop with all this bullshit?
She starts spiraling into reckless choices, doing increasingly aimless and violent actions for the revolution that ultimately gets her arrested. And when she is arrested, she snitches on her friends in order to make sure that she stays out of jail and ultimately escapes and flees to Mexico, leaving behind her child, her movement, her integrity, and the narrative itself completely. And the film never interrogates our implicit cultural assumptions around women supposedly naturally craving domesticity and motherhood, which then leaves us to judge Perfidia's actions by that standard, especially in light of the fact that she's a snitch.
I put myself first.
Basically what I'm trying to get at is that the film asks us to judge Perfidia by our own cultural biases of womanhood and motherhood, all while objectifying her in ways that mirror a male gaze that is made even more disturbing given the violent sexual history that the movie is evoking, and never lets us really get more complexity about Perfidia beyond that. While there are some sequences later in the film where Perfidia's child wrestles with the complexities of her mother's history.
Do I look just like her?
No, not really. But you do on the inside, which makes you quite a risk around here. The daughter of a rat is a baby rat.
We never really get a sense that the movie itself wants us to see her in that complex way, instead asking us to see her child as being able to move beyond her mother's faults.
I pretended my whole life. I pretended to be strong, pretended to be dead. Is it too late for us? After all my lies, what will you do when you get older? Will you try and change the world like I did? We failed. But maybe you will not.
This framing is even more disturbing, given that actress Tiana Taylor has acknowledged that Perfidia was directly inspired by Black Liberation Army leader Assata Shakur.
Perfidia still has her own characteristics, and it was loosely based on Assata.
Like Perfidia, Shakur engaged in guerrilla tactics against the United States and also gave birth to a child during this time, a child who she later had to leave behind when she went into political exile outside of the United States. But unlike Perfidia, as writer Brooke Obi highlights in her amazing essay that I highly recommend that you go and read, Shakur herself endured repeated attempts by the police to force her to miscarry her child while she was imprisoned, before she ultimately had to leave her child when she escaped to Cuba. And in her autobiography, Shakur wrote,
"I am about life," I said to myself. "I'm gonna live as hard as I can and as full as I can until I die. And I'm not letting these parasites, these oppressors, this greed, these racist swine make me kill my children in my mind before they are even born. I'm going to live because our children are our futures, and I believe in the future and in the strength and rightness of our struggle."
As we can clearly see in that quote, Assata was a woman who fought deeply for life and community in the face of a world that wanted to destroy her, her community, and the networks of care that she helped build with the Black Panthers for both herself, her community, and for future generations within that community. Perfidia, by contrast, is shown to never be meaningfully shaped by any of these things. Instead, her rebellion reflects American individualistic self-autonomy desires, not a desire to build a project shaped by history or community. And the film, on top of that, pushes us to judge Perfidia through patriarchal and racialized lenses that it never interrogates. And all of this reflects a broader ideological ignorance in depictions of revolution, where gender, race, and queerness are treated as secondary to an imagined universal uprising, despite real anti-state movements constantly demonstrating the opposite. Anthropologist Sherry Oatner argues in the book Making Gender that women's oppression grows alongside state hierarchies, where controlling reproduction becomes central to maintaining state power. You can't dismantle the state if you're not also dismantling structures that it's built on, like patriarchy, which is something groups like the Black Panthers understood when they began to center women like Assata and built reproductive and community survival programs into their revolutionary work. Instead, One Battle After Another reproduces these same hierarchies inside of its own narrative, treating Perfidia's gender and blackness as liabilities that undermine revolutions when, in fact, they are foundational to it. As a result, movies like One Battle After Another don't actually support revolution, they instead neutralize it. They borrow its language, imagery, even its rage for its emotional beats, but strip that revolution of vision and discipline, so it ends up reinforcing these same structures and implicit biases that many of these actual groups fought directly against. Hollywood will let revolution feel good, it just won't let it mean anything. All of this brings us back to Andor, which surprisingly sidesteps many of these Hollywood tropes. In Season 2, for example, Cassian gets captured by a disorganized rebel group whose childish infighting and dysfunction feels straight from the French 75 playbook.
Argue all you want, but we're all part of the same rebellion!
Your friend was hostile.
He was on a mission.
But unlike One Battle After Another, Andor contextualizes that chaos as evolving into a more organized, coherent resistance network that we see becomes the Rebel Alliance, offering us a more realistic depiction of how revolutionary movements actually evolve and ultimately organize. What makes the show even stronger is that it explores many different revolutionary dynamics instead of just giving us one. You see the extremist willing to use indiscriminate violence, the strategic radical thinking long-term planner, the ground-level soldier, the everyday civilians who help sustain their resistance, and even the far-right radicalized young man pulled into fascism's cult of heroism, only to be used and discarded by the system that he worships. Even characters like Saw Gerrera, who in other Star Wars media like Rebels is often depicted as the indigenous terrorist who goes too far, driven by revenge and seeking indiscriminate violence.
When we were on Geonosis with Saw, we didn't always agree with how he did things. But it seems like he's the only one who doesn't care about all the politics. He just fights.
Ezra, it's not whether or not we fight. It's
how we choose to fight that matters. I know, Kanan.
Is here in Andor humanized and given understandable justifications for his extremism. Andor, as a show, treats revolutionary politics as a messy ecosystem of motives, organizational levels, solidarity, and internal contradictions. And this more grounded approach comes from Tony Gilroy himself, who drew directly on specific revolutionary history rather than simply borrowing its aesthetic. Andor pulls from movements like the French Resistance, the 1907 Tiflis bank robbery that helped fund the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, an operation that Stalin himself was involved in, as well as the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, an influence that feels especially resonant given that Cassian actor Diego Luna participated in solidarity efforts organizing food drives and protests for the Zapatistas when he was just 15. And personally, I believe that historical specificity is part of why Andor has become a real-world inspiration for much of left-wing organizing in the United States. Especially considering the portrayal of the authoritarian state power through the fascist-coded empire in the show so closely echoes Trump's own increasingly fascist actions and policies. I mean, take for example Cassian's incidental arrest in season 1 where he's detained and stripped of due process and ultimately thrown into a dehumanizing prison by a militarized police force for simply being in the wrong place, and how that echoes ICE's current tactics against non-white immigrants in the United States. Not to mention the systemically racist function of the US judicial and prison system. Or take how the Empire's manufactured crisis on Goldman in the show that was engineered to justify a genocide so the Empire could ultimately seize the planet's natural resources has so closely mapped onto the Trump administration's own framing of the Venezuelan government as a narco-terrorist state in order to justify the United States' own escalating military actions against Venezuela.
On social media, South Florida Representative Maria Salazar said the Cartel of the Suns is officially recognized as a terrorist organization, exactly what Venezuelans have known for years, adding for too long the Maduro regime has financed narco-terrorism and tyranny in Venezuela and throughout our hemisphere. This move gives the Trump administration broader power to target and dismantle cartels and even expand authority to take action in Venezuela, like imposing fresh sanctions against Maduro's assets and infrastructure.
That storyline so mirrored what's happening in Venezuela that the Goldman senator saying,
"They don't even bother to lie badly anymore. I suppose that's the final humiliation,"
honestly perfectly captured Trump's own complete abandonment of any pretense of protecting freedom and democracy that so often accompanies many US imperial actions, with him instead just openly admitting that he wanted to seize Venezuela's deep foliated oil.
Calcite. Synthetic calcite. Calcite alternative.
We're going to have a presence in Venezuela as it pertains to oil, but we're going to get the oil flowing the way it should be.
Or how, during the editing of this video, the Trump administration began a blatantly imperialistic war with Iran, literally killing Iranian schoolgirls as one of the first acts of that war, as well as Donald Trump openly threatening the complete genocide of Iranians, all in a facile, idiotic attempt to control Iran's oil, while hypocritically dressing it up in the language of liberating people from a repressed theocratic government.
A new video appears to show a U.S. airstrike on an Iranian military base right next to the elementary school where Iranian state media says more than 160 girls were killed. CNN's Isabel Young looks at the video and the evidence that suggests the U.S. may be responsible for that strike on the school.
Yet despite rejecting Hollywood's usual diminutive revolutionary tropes and standing as a powerful anti-fascist, anti-authoritarian work of art, and even despite inspiring real-world rhetoric in the fight against fascism in the United States, Tony Gilroy has still argued that Andor isn't a leftist show for one very specific reason.
But there's never anybody, I don't think, who ever espouses an actual ideology of what they want to achieve at the end, other than to please leave us alone, stop killing us, stop destroying our communities, don't build the Death Star and kill us. There's not I never have a character, I don't think, stand up and say, this is the galaxy that I am trying to build, and this is what I want to see.
Tony Gilroy points out that none of the show's revolutionary characters ever articulates a political vision beyond wanting to fight the Empire's authoritarianism and colonial violence. No character pitches a communist state, no one has an anarchist utopia in their mind, hell, no one even does a video essay. Are you even a leftist movement if you don't have video essayists? The closest we do get is my too innocent for this world revolutionary twink Nemec, who writes an anti-imperialist manifesto in the show that inspires the most poetic speech in the whole series, one that ultimately inspires Cassian to join the rebellion at the end of season 1, and one that haunts the head of the surveillance and intelligence agency, the ISB, at the end of season 2.
Tyranny requires constant effort. It breaks. It leaks. Authority is brittle. Oppression is the mask of fear.
I'm assuming you've heard it before.
Bits and pieces.
Just keep spreading, doesn't it?
A manifesto that we clearly see has helped shape the political rhetoric and vision of the anti-empire movement within the universe of the show.
And then remember this. The imperial need for control is so desperate because it is so unnatural. Tyranny requires constant effort. It breaks. It leaks. Authority is brittle. Oppression is the mask of fear. Remember that. I know this. The day will come when all these skirmishes and battles, these moments of defiance will have flooded the banks of the Empire's authority, and then there will be one too many. One single thing will break the siege. Remember this. Try.
That speech is such a beautiful rumination on the necessity of continual resistance against power, even when we lose some battles, that it's so easy to understand why people have used it at anti-Trump protests.
The day will come when all of these fights, these moments of defiance, will have flooded the banks of the Empire's authority, and then there will be one too many. One single thing will break them.
But as inspiring as that speech is, it still doesn't articulate a coherent project beyond fighting back against authoritarian oppression. And this is a problem that Andor shares with One Battle After Another, and nearly every other example that I've mentioned in this video. All of these works of art that were funded by Hollywood or American megacorporations show resistance, but rarely show what that resistance is for. And it reveals how little we are allowed to imagine other worlds, other ways of existing that we can be fighting for. This is why, by the way, Tony Gilroy pointed out to good old Rossi Boy that Andor isn't actually antithetical to an American conservative worldview.
But it's a story, but it's a political story about
Do you
revolutionary...
identify with the Empire? Do you identify with the Empire?
No, I don't.
To drill in on this, because I think it's important for where we're going to go here, American conservative mythology has long wrapped itself in don't tread on me anti-authoritarian rhetoric, rooted as it is all the way back in the mythology of the American Revolution and fighting back against the British. This is anti-authoritarian populist rhetoric that we still hear echoed today in more modern conservative movements, like in Ronald Reagan's war on big government and Trump's promise to drain the swamp. But that conservative mythology has always carried with it an unspoken second clause. Don't tread on me, because I am supposed to tread on you. Conservatism, in the American context, rarely opposes actual authoritarianism. What it actually opposes is the disruption of a white supremacist patriarchal hierarchy that has been made to seem natural by being made invisible through state and cultural institutions. You can see this most clearly in the nostalgic mythologizing that many conservatives do around the Civil War. Mythologizing that reframes a war that was fought to preserve the state-enforced racial economic system of slavery into a heroic stand for states' rights, and has become enshrined as part of their anti-authoritarian heritage. This is ultimately why many conservatives who fantasize about resisting big government still cheer on when Trump himself deploys the National Guard against so-called woke liberal cities like Portland, or accept the official narratives justifying ICE killings of people like Renee Good or Alex Preddy, even when we have very clear video evidence that contradicts those narratives. This is because American conservatives treat state violence as justified whenever it enforces the correct social order, While many conservatives may not consciously understand this, what they define as authoritarianism is not state or institutional power that oppresses them, but as anyone who threatens the rigid hierarchies they've been taught are common sense, natural, Western, or God-ordained, labels that change depending on which institution they're ultimately listening to. And anything outside of that rigidly binary social order, be it different genders, sexualities, religions, or family structures, is imagined as treading on their freedom. It must be forced back into the binary, or wholesale eliminated because it doesn't fit in the us versus them story. And as a result, conservatives are ultimately incapable of seeing anything outside of the us versus them team sports logic. It's why, for example, if someone like me says, I hate Trump, many conservatives will automatically assume that I'm a Biden-loving liberal, even though I also don't like Biden. It's because if I don't belong on their team, I must belong on the opposite team, because it's the only way they contextualize and understand political disagreement, us versus them. And ultimately then, the victory of their team matters more than recognizing how the same systems exploit and disenfranchise them as well. So long as black people, or immigrants, or trans people, or woke liberals, or anyone they've been told isn't on their team suffers more, they're ultimately going to be happy. Which brings us back to our cultural stories, because that same mental framework shapes how conservatives consume culture. Films like Star Wars or The Matrix have always been critiques of imperialism and capitalism, yet reactionary audiences reduce these stories mainly to their aesthetic of rebellion. And this is why the red pill rhetoric took hold in conservative spaces, or how right-wing fans can cast themselves as Luke Skywalker, despite the fact that George Lucas himself has often pointed out that the Empire mirrored American imperialism.
Something very interesting with Star Wars, if you think about it. The good guys are the rebels. They're using asymmetric warfare against a highly organized empire. I think we call those guys terrorists today. We call them Mujahideen, we call them Al-Qaeda.
When I did it, they were Viet Cong.
Exactly. So were you thinking of that at the time?
Yes. You know, we're fighting the largest empire in the world.
Right.
And we're just a bunch of hayseeds in coonskin hats who don't know nothing.
That's right.
And it was the same thing with the Vietnamese.
Yep.
The irony of that one is in both of those, the little guys won.
Right.
And the big, highly technical empire.
The English Empire, right?
The English Empire, the American Empire,
Yep.
lost.
Yeah.
That was the whole point.
These conservatives claimed these cultural stories for themselves by removing the very important context by which these stories were placed within. But when Hollywood in the past couple decades started swapping in women, people of color, or queer people into stories that were usually reserved for white, male-centric heroes, with Hollywood finally giving the hero with 1,000 faces actually 1,000 faces, because it sold well during the Obama-era post-racial fantasy, many of these stories suddenly felt stolen from conservatives. The actual myth and meaning behind many of these stories didn't actually meaningfully change. In fact, it still upheld the American ideal of individuals who get to change societies, great men being the movers and shakers of history, but it was just now new faces like queer people, people of color, and women telling that story. And ultimately, this is why franchises like Star Wars, or more recently Star Trek, have become radicalizing flashpoints for reactionary ideology, with reactionary audiences recasting Hollywood as an institution that needs to be restored from supposed cultural saboteurs like Kathleen Kennedy. And it's also why nearly every major studio release now gets framed as woke, DEI, man-hating, far-left Marxist propaganda, despite them usually being mostly the cinematic equivalent of reheated leftovers. And you can see the same antagonistic team sports logic in Ross's conversation with Gilroy.
Is Andor a left-wing show? Because this is something that I've said a couple times in my writing about it, using it literally as an example as a conservative columnist of a work of art that I think of as having different politics from my own that I really, really like. And I've had friends, especially on the right, come back to me and say, oh, you know, it's not left wing or right wing. It's just a TV show about resistance to tyranny. But I think you've made a left wing work of art. What do you think?
I mean, it's so clear how Ross is smugly trying to set Gilroy up to admit Andor is a leftist show because Ross assumes a woke Hollywood writer like Gilroy must be advancing a partisan agenda, literally scoffing when Gilroy said that he never saw the show in leftist terms. And that's not me editorializing, by the way. It's actually cut from the podcast, but the New York Times official transcript of the episode literally says Ross scoffs when Gilroy says that he doesn't think Star Wars Andor is a leftist show. For conservatives like Ross, if something feels oppositional to their worldview, it must be for the other team. And because the aesthetic of revolutionary struggle currently belongs to the American political left, Ross then reads Andor as leftist, even though he likely identified with the rebels when he watched Star Wars the first time. Even though he may not consciously realize it, Ross does, on some level, identify with the Empire. Not because he thinks he's a fascist, even though he supports fascists, but because he's trying to map a story rooted in global histories of revolution onto an American political framework that simply doesn't fit. It's a shallow understanding of politics that is fundamentally incapable of understanding what Andor is saying about revolution or how revolutionary history actually works. And all of this is why corporations like Disney and Skydance can pull back to 4-quadrant tentpole films that center male protagonists, because they ultimately know that American audiences will show up for a movie with white men in lead roles, but some people in this country will just fundamentally refuse to identify with anyone else. And if we're being honest, the conservative vision is more honest about who these storytelling frameworks were built for than the softer, more conformist language of liberal inclusion is. Because while I do agree with Gilroy that Andor isn't leftist nor anti-conservative, I do disagree that the series lacks an ideology. Because we often forget that the heroes in Star Wars aren't just called the Rebel Alliance. The group's full name is the Rebel Alliance to Restore the Republic. Seriously, don't believe me? Look it up on Wikipedia. If you type in the Rebel Alliance, it literally redirects you to the Rebel Alliance to Restore the Republic. What do you mean you're not regularly looking stuff up on Wikipedia? What kind of person are you? Is it just me? Is it just me? The fall of the Empire in Star Wars ultimately gives way, as we see in the Disney films, to a new republic. A galactic state that largely reinstates the same capitalist-driven, neoliberal democratic institutions that enabled fascism's rise in the first place that we saw in the prequels. And ultimately, what Star Wars as a franchise reflects, even if unintentionally, is the fact that fascism isn't actually an aberration of Western neoliberal democracy. It's actually one of its enforcement mechanisms. Because when capitalism's inequalities grow too visible and overt, and when people begin to demand redistribution, liberation, or an end to exploitation, fascism then steps in to violently reassert state control. It openly weaponizes naturalized hierarchies of white supremacy, patriarchy, and nationalist mythologies to protect capital ultimately, disciplining populations within the state through fear, militarization, and the manufacturing of both internal and external enemies. And when fascism inevitably burns itself out, because it will inevitably burn itself out because it's a self-defeating ideology, a liberal order will step back in and declare victory for the inherent goodness of law and order that fascism so degraded.
Let's restore not just hope and optimism, but let's also stand up as we take back the house. Let's stand up. Let's stand up to those that have been humiliated, those that feel bullied, those that are afraid and scared. Let's stand up for those that have given up, and let's give them hope. Let's stand up for the rule of law. Let's stand up for a system of checks and balances, and let's stand up for our democracy.
All while ignoring that these same institutions were the ones used to fuel fascism's rise and violence in the first place, and ultimately preserve the newly hardened social and economic hierarchies and consolidated power of capital that was built up under fascism, just now under a new liberal order. And I want to be very, very clear here before we get into this next section, so let me just state this outright. We should be fighting fascism. Fuck ICE, fuck Trump, fuck his entire administration. But stopping fascism isn't enough. Because if we're not dismantling the capitalist structures that continually produce the fear, scarcity, and hierarchy that fascism feeds upon, we're not going to end the cycle. We're just going to stabilize it long enough for fascism to ultimately reemerge the next time capitalism enters a crisis. We see this cycle very clearly in post-war Western Germany. After the Nazis were removed from power by the Western Allies, Germany didn't simply revert to the more permissive legal norms that defined the Weimar era. In many cases, laws that were expanded under Nazism remained fully intact in the new liberal state. For example, paragraph 175, which had criminalized homosexual acts during the Weimar era and was regularly being petitioned for reform by activists like Magnus Hirschfeld, was expanded by the Nazis in order to criminalize even suspected intent of homosexuality, which allowed the Nazis to indiscriminately send anyone that they suspected of being gay or accused of being gay to concentration camps. But post-World War II Allied authorities left that expanded paragraph 175 law intact when they set up the new Western German government. And in some cases, that same government sent gay men who were concentration camp survivors right back to prison. There's even stories of gay men who were sentenced by the same judges who had sentenced them under the Nazi regime to concentration camps.
Even though the Nazis had amended paragraph 175 because they viewed homosexuality as a racial and political threat, when the United States released the list of laws that would be abolished in the new German Penal Code, paragraph 175 was not included. On numerous occasions after the founding of the Federal Republic in 1949, Western German officials pointed to the Allied decision as justification for the continued use of the law.
Meanwhile, the post-war Federal Republic of Germany, which was founded in explicit rejection of fascism and was positioned as a Cold War bulwark against the growing Soviet Union state, ultimately began centralizing Familienpolitik, if I can speak some level of German correctly, a politics that ultimately promoted the nuclear family as the core of national reconstruction post-Nazism, with male breadwinners and compulsory motherhood framed as a patriotic duty. All of this culminated in the creation of a federal ministry for family affairs in 1953. We can see that all of this preserved many of the hierarchies about gender and sexuality that the Nazis had reinforced, now simply repackaged through liberalist ideals while presenting it as a patriotic duty and natural, moral, and politically neutral, while still reifying it into law to control people's abilities to exist otherwise. And in this way, liberal post-war reconstruction in Germany did not dismantle the structural relationship between gender hierarchy and economic production. It simply made it appear voluntary in comparison to fascism's violent enforcement of those same ideals. Ultimately, while Germany partially reformed paragraph 175 in 1969, the law remained on the books until its full repeal in 1994, nearly 50 years later, which, not incidentally, was around the time when, wouldn't you know it, fascism began rising again.
When everyone does his regular job and helps out by doing extra work, then things go better for the whole family.
Because for decades, the nuclear family had been promoted as society's foundation, while queer people were forced underground. And when queer people were finally able to live more openly, fascists weaponized that visibility as proof that Western society was in decay by framing queer people as newly emerging abnormalities, using that narrative to justify calls to violently reassert that order, erasing the reality that queer people had always existed but had been policed and forced out of public view, thus creating a self-perpetuating cycle of violence, in which fascism plays a key part. What followed Nazism in Germany was not freedom, but continued repression laundered through liberal democracy and sold as stability. And we're seeing that same pattern repeat itself in the United States today. Liberal politicians may eventually push Trump out of office and roll back some of his most visible excesses, but the expanded powers of the centralized state and the deregulated economic structures that Trump pushed for will likely remain intact. We've already seen this happen repeatedly. For example, Bill Clinton didn't dismantle Ronald Reagan's neoliberal economic revolution, but instead cemented it through financial deregulation, trade agreements with NAFTA, gutting welfare programs, and just ultimately accelerating the neoliberal shift towards corporate power, and entrenching that ideology within the Democratic Party.
We have benefited for 60 years by leading the way to integrate the world's economies, and that will promote peace, it will promote freedom, it will promote stability, it will raise the level of living standards in other parts of the world, even as it maintains America as the world's most prosperous nation.
Obama himself followed George W. Bush, not by rolling back deregulation, but by instead reauthorizing the Patriot Act, one of the most openly authoritarian laws in then recent US history. Biden kept many of Trump's first administration's border and immigration policies, and largely maintained the corporate-friendly regulatory landscape that both parties have built for decades.
To folks in this region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek to the United States-Mexico border, Do not come. Do not come.
We should all agree the answer is not to defund the police. It's to fund the police. Fund them. Fund them.
As Commander-in-Chief, I will ensure America always has the strongest, most lethal fighting force in the world.
Each liberal administration over the past few decades has inherited the economic framework that conservatives have built, but then softened its more visible brutality and rhetoric, and then legitimized it by making it appear stable, responsible, and ultimately just inevitable. And so, the Democratic Party and liberals in the United States have helped inequality grow just more slowly, while just simply symbolically widening inclusion without doing anything to threaten the system that is built on those very same economic inequalities.
They built cages. You know, they used to say, I built the cages. And then they had a picture in a certain newspaper, and it was a picture of these horrible cages. And they said, look at these cages. President Trump built them. And then it was determined they were built in 2014. That was him.
Let me ask you a follow-up
Kristen,
question.
they did it. We changed the policy.
Your response
they
to that?
They did it. We changed.
Did not
they built the
separate
cages.
They,
who built the cages, Joe?
Let's talk about what
who
we're
built the
talking
cages,
about.
Joe?
Let's talk about what we're talking about. What happened? Parents were ripped, their kids were ripped from their arms and separated. And now they cannot find over 500 of sets of those parents, and those kids are alone. Nowhere to go. Nowhere to go. It's criminal.
Who built the cages? I'd love you to ask him that. Who built the cages?
Let me ask.
We must let the wheels of the Senate turn.
And this wheel keeps on turning as the system presents itself as having learned its lesson and grown, all until those same economic instabilities and social precarity once again create the conditions for authoritarian backlash once again. Yet at the same time, so much of American corporate-backed mainstream media repeatedly teaches audiences that institutions themselves are fundamentally noble, but just occasionally corrupted by bad actors, because that framework ultimately protects faith in the very structures that sustain corporate capitalist power. Movies like Captain America: The Winter Soldier give us a clear example of this, where we have S.H.I.E.L.D., an intelligence agency clearly modeled after the CIA, just expanded out to become the literal world police, and supposedly apolitical because it's not tied to any specific nation, despite being based in America and run very much by Americans, is presented in the film as a fundamentally good organization that has become corrupted by Hydra, Nazi-coded infiltrators, in a clear allusion to Operation Paperclip.
It was Operation Paperclip after World War II. S.H.I.E.L.D. recruited German scientists with strategic value.
They thought I could help their cause. I also helped my own.
Yet once we purge the fascists from the organization by the next Avengers movie, the institution is supposedly able to return to its noble purpose of enforcing democracy around the world as the literal world police.
This is S.H.I.E.L.D.?
This is what S.H.I.E.L.D.'s supposed to be.
This is not so bad.
One Battle After Another also does the same thing when it presents the Christmas Adventurers Club as a secret cabal of white supremacists capable of weaponizing institutions like the military or the police, but still treating them as the main source of institutional white supremacist violence, rather than having the film engage with the systemic structures that allow that violence to thrive in the first place. But even more interestingly to me, this logic gets echoed in liberal political rhetoric. Many liberal-leaning Americans, for example, have recently described ICE as the Gestapo.
Donald Trump's modern-day Gestapo is scooping folks up off the streets. They're in unmarked vans, wearing masks, being shipped off to foreign torture dungeons. No chance to mount a defense, not even a chance to kiss a loved one goodbye, just grabbed up by masked agents, shoved into those vans, and disappeared.
And while that rhetoric does correctly label ICE as the fascist thugs that they are, it also at the same time simultaneously disowns ICE by treating it as something exceptional and fundamentally un-American. In truth, ICE's use of surveillance, racial profiling, mass detention, its willingness to use lethal violence, and the criminalization of entire communities have very clear American precedents. We can go all the way back to American chattel slavery and the slave patrols, which were state-sanctioned groups that were empowered to stop, search, detain, and brutalize any black people that they came across without cause, regardless of if those people were slaves or freed. all in order to enforce a racial order where black people were policed and have to live in constant fear. The institution of the police in America itself came directly out of slave patrols, which have evolved into the modern-day police forces, reflected in how they both surveil and violently repress black communities. On top of that, many American police forces were also developed in part to violently suppress working-class labor movements that were happening around the turn of the 20th century, as Maggie Mae Fish explored in her own recent excellent video.
The origins of policing are fraught, and that their creation was born out of deeply racist and classist circumstances. The first original police force was formed as a way to control rebellion in Ireland against the colonial occupation by the British. In 1838, this idea of policing transported over to Boston in America, where the Industrial Revolution had created a working class that would often organize for better working conditions or wages. The police force were used to control the working class and enforce laws passed by wealthy statesmen in order to keep the workers at their jobs and compliant.
On top of all of this, ICE itself, while created by Bush after 9/11, have functioned perfectly fine under both liberal and conservative administrations. ICE was still functioning under Obama and Biden as much as it was under Bush and Trump's administrations. ICE and Trump's fascism are not what America is, as liberals often claim, but instead emerges naturally from institutions that are built on colonialism, racial control, and the protection of property and capital over people. The only real change that we're seeing under Trump is where that violence is getting directed and how blatant that violence actually is, expanding outwards to the types of people that it was never supposed to touch, all ultimately to reinforce the implicit hierarchies woven into this country's foundation. And yet, many Americans still extract away our own complicity within these very systems. Take, for example, how singer Billie Eilish recently acknowledged at the Grammy Awards that the US exists on stolen land.
No one is illegal on stolen land.
She did so as a rebuke to Trump's immigration policies. But right afterwards, the Tungava tribe representatives respectfully pointed out that Billie Eilish didn't even name the specific nations displaced from the land that she herself owns in Los Angeles. To me, this ultimately became a perfect symbol of how we can recognize injustice in the abstract in order to indict fascism, but avoid the extent to which it's embedded in the very systems and lives that we still benefit from. And this dynamic, by the way, mirrors how Hollywood and American propaganda historically depicted rival communist nation-states like the Soviet Union or China, especially during the Red Scare. Rather than dealing with the material realities or internal contradictions of these communist states, films like Red Dawn or Rocky IV flatten them into hyper-disciplined, surveillance-obsessed, militarized monoliths defined by total ideological conformity and expansionist ambition, often framed through xenophobia, especially in the case of China. And these portrayals in American media help to justify America's containment policies, its proxy wars, and its global militant expansion around the world, as well as its policing anyone with even suspected communist sympathies at home, especially in Hollywood itself. We still see echoes of this Red Scare mentality today in US media, such as in Apple TV Plus's For All Mankind TV show. Aside here, but as much as I enjoyed that series' early seasons as a sci-fi fan, I am actively dreading that Soviet Union set Star City spinoff that they're doing. I can't wait to see what else they get wrong about the Soviet Union. And all of this results in a mythology in which authoritarianism is imagined as something that arrives from outside America at all times, not something that can emerge from American institutions themselves. And if it does, it's an aberration of these institutions, not something that was directly caused by them. What all of this often does is frame fascism as an external monster that we, the people, get to overthrow heroically. We get the emotional catharsis of a revolution, and we get to feel like we fought for a new world, a new vision, when really we're just resetting liberal norms back to factory settings. And this is why anti-authoritarian stories with anti-fascist aesthetics like Star Wars Andor or One Battle After Another get labeled leftist in America. Because our schools, our media, and our popular storytelling have trained us to treat overthrowing fascism as a radical transformation in and of itself, when more often it is simply stabilizing the same capitalist elite structures that work just fine under fascism or liberal democracy, because both of these structures are still built on the same underlying hierarchies that are exploited by each system through institutions of centralized power. hierarchies of patriarchy, white supremacy, heteronormativity at all. And Andor, in its own story, mirrors this dynamic. The rebellion against the Empire ends up being led largely by the Old Republic's political aristocracy. People like Mon Mothma, or Bail Organa, or whoever this asshole is, or Admiral Akbar, who remains a perfect angel who has never done anything wrong in his life. But this is the same exact institutional class that the Empire came out of in the first place. I mean, Palpatine was literally a Naboo senator.
I love democracy. I love the Republic.
And so what began as a resistance started by workers, colonized peoples, slowly got claimed by and redirected towards restoring the very system that once empowered these elites. The same system that history keeps showing us has a nasty, unfortunate habit of sliding right back towards authoritarianism whenever it needs to. And yet, the story of Andor, or Star Wars generally, doesn't really invite us to question that outcome. And we see right now this same dynamic happening in the United States. The political elite in America have consistently tried to recuperate revolutionary anti-authoritarian energy back into electoral politics for their own power. Take how everyone's favorite Democrat Pete Buttigieg recently released a video responding to the anti-ICE protests in Minneapolis, saying that
all of it is adding up into an accelerating change in the power dynamics of this country.
And he's not wrong about that statement, because we are seeing a shift in power in Minneapolis, as the city's citizens, in response to ICE, have organized to protect their neighbors while also providing food, supplies, and care to those in need, not only showing a defiance of American federal power, but demonstrating a community's ability to support itself outside the apparatuses of the state. According to Margaret Killjoy's excellent reporting,
there are two sides to this struggle: rapid response and mutual aid. Rapid response networks organized to identify and track ICE vehicles and agents and to disrupt abductions in process. Mutual aid networks organized to get affected people food, medical care, rides, vet visits, company, whatever they need. These are two separate webs of networks. The mutual aid side is more secretive in its organizing, of course, because it is taking care of the people who cannot leave their homes without being kidnapped. Partly because there's no central organization, it's hard to get a sense of the scale of these networks, especially the mutual aid networks. There are tens of thousands of people at least being cared for by these networks. When I ask people where all this came from, the answer is never some specific organization or network or coalition. Organizations, networks, and coalitions are part of this, absolutely. But the core of the resistance is just neighborliness. I cannot emphasize the decentralization of these networks enough. Decentralized networks are harder to infiltrate and harder to destroy. This movement is not leaderless, but leaderful. There are no specific people who could be arrested to stop the movement. None of this works top down.
But the change that Buttigieg identifies happening because of Minneapolis isn't communities feeding each other, communities feeding and protecting children, or them resisting state violence, or building up solidarity networks within Minneapolis, but instead the fact that Republicans are softening their stance on ICE or turning on Trump.
Congressional Republicans have begun changing their behavior, suddenly calling for hearings and investigations over the Trump administration's behavior. A top commander of Customs and Border Patrol has just been sidelined. The president himself is showing signs of doing the one thing he claims he'll never do, which is back down.
At the same time, Buttigieg never names any changes in Democratic policy or rhetoric that is happening in this country, ultimately then implying that the shift in power dynamics that he is referring to is the shift in power back to Democrats, rather than a fundamental shift in recognizing working class power. In other words, even as people demonstrate on the ground in Minneapolis what collective power held by the people actually looks like, liberal leadership keeps trying to redirect that energy back towards the restoration of the same system that led us here in the first place. And this is how people end up championing figures and policies that are anti-Trump in rhetoric, but still support corporate deregulation and intensified policing of marginalized communities and the expansion of state power. I mean, take a look at California Governor Gavin fucking Newsom, the man who many journalists already are positioning as the leading Democratic contender for the 2028 presidential election. Newsom has built his popularity up in the past year on meme-ready anti-Trump posturing, as well as cultural and political antagonism towards MAGA. This includes one of his most popular political moves, which was pushing for redistricting California in response to Texas Republicans doing the same in their state.
No crowns, no thrones, no kings. That's what this victory represents. It's a victory for the people of the state of California and the United States of America.
In our politics lead, that is Gavin Newsom, California's Democratic governor and a possible 2028 presidential hopeful who scored a major win last night after voters in his state overwhelmingly approved his effort to make 5 U.S. House districts more favorable to Democrats. This is in direct response to Texas Republicans redrawing their state's congressional maps mid-decade in hopes of moving 5 House seats to the right.
And within the narrow logic of institutional politics, that tactic may be defensible. But it's only defensible if your understanding of confronting authoritarianism like Trump never extends beyond playing procedural chicken with each other. Redistricting to entrench Democratic political power, even if justified through fighting fascism and Republicans doing the same, still centralizes power upwards for the Democratic Party and treats democracy itself as something to be managed rather than expanded. And if we actually look at many of Newsom's policies here in California, where I live, Newsom himself has supported violent sweeps against unhoused people. He's parroted far-right talking points on trans issues in recent years.
Yeah. Let's give them compassion. What's not fair is just for like a entire women's sports.
I agree. So I completely align with you.
The most effective ad. You know what it is.
Yeah, and devastating. Trump's for you, she's for they, them.
And
devastating.
Devastating.
The resistance that Newsom embodies looks bold because it opposes Trump, but is anything but fighting back against any sort of institutional power. And so we can see how this team sports logic doesn't just end up with conservatives in America, but also within liberals. And that team sports logic then pushes political liberals to police themselves, attacking any deviation from institutional politics and reinforcing the very hierarchies that liberalism claims, at least rhetorically, to oppose. We can see this in how, during the 2024 election cycle, liberal discourse routinely framed any criticism of the Democratic Party as helping Trump. Take, for example, when singer Chappell Roan criticized Kamala Harris over her support for Israel, as well as her rhetoric around trans people.
I have so many issues with our government in every way, she says. There are so many things that I would want to change, so I don't feel pressured to endorse someone. There's problems on both sides, and I encourage people to use your critical thinking skills. Use your vote. Vote small. Vote for what's going on in your city. The change she wants to see in the U.S. is this election year, she says, instantly is trans rights. They cannot have cis people making decisions for trans people, period.
Many liberals dogpiled Roan and accused her of secretly supporting Republicans, shutting down a needed conversation that she was trying to spark about Democrats abandoning Palestinians and trans rights.
Hear it from my mouth, if you're still wondering. No, I'm not voting for Trump. And yes, I will always question those in power. I'm sorry that you fell for the clickbait.
A recurring dynamic of harassment and abuse that ultimately gave the Democratic Party an excuse not to change its rhetoric at all.
And let me be clear, I will always stand up for Israel's right to defend itself, and I will always ensure Israel has the ability to defend itself.
And as we head into the midterm 2028 election cycle, we're seeing the same dynamic happening again. To use myself as an example, because, I'm a YouTuber, so I'm going to talk about myself at some point in this video. Back in January of 2026, I posted over on Blue Sky criticizing Pete Buttigieg's video that I talked about earlier, and his attempt to funnel anti-authoritarian energy in Minneapolis back into the Democratic Party. And I wrote in one of my posts,
"Real change does not and will not ever happen in the voting booth."
And that post... Whoo boy, that post got me flooded with harassment, largely from liberals and even some self-identified leftists who believed that I, by making that post, was making an argument for apathy and voter suppression, supposedly arguing that voting doesn't make a material difference, which is very far from what I was saying.
That sign can't stop me because I can't read.
In reality, if you actually want to know my thoughts, I do believe that there would be many material differences if someone like Kamala Harris had won instead of Trump in 2026. For example, Alex Preddy and Renee Good would likely still be alive, as well as many immigrants that we don't talk about as much would not have been killed, nor would many others not have been deported or separated from their families. Many trans people also wouldn't be fearing for our healthcare or even our basic right to exist publicly. Many people of color would not have lost their jobs or face continued harassment in this country as well. And while America would most certainly have continued supporting Israel under Kamala Harris, including its ongoing genocide against Palestinians, including Palestinian children, and would have continued to back imperial violence across the world, it almost certainly would not have so haphazardly entered into a war alongside Israel against Iran. Meaning that while America would still be complicit in the killing of children even if Kamala had won, there would be, very likely, a specific school full of Iranian children still alive today if she had been elected, which is not immaterial in any sense. Those are just some of the many, many real material differences I believe we'd have if Kamala Harris had won. Nor do I believe that positive movement cannot occur within electoral politics. Despite an establishment Democratic Party that so often seems structurally incapable of pursuing transformative change, there are politicians and movements working within electoral politics who are genuinely trying to deliver programs that materially improve people's lives. Zoran Mamdani has proven that.
When I ran for mayor, I said I was going to tax the rich. Well, today, we're taxing the rich.
But the unfortunate reality is that these efforts function as band-aids on an already broken system, and we can already see how much of Mamdani's work is constrained by entrenched political interests and institutional pressures. We've seen him apologize to the NYPD during his campaign, appoint Jessica Trish, an openly Zionist figure, as a police commissioner, and distancing himself from more overt socialist labels and policies in a country that aggressively demonizes it. All things that FD Signifier, by the way, went into greater detail in his own excellent video. That's what I was actually trying to say with my post. Not that voting or electoral politics is meaningless, but that the system itself disciplines and absorbs even its most ambitious reformers and continually narrows the horizon of what's possible in order to preserve the underlying systems of exploitation and capital. Voting does not dismantle the systems that produce all of this violence in the first place. At the very best, Democrats, if they had won, would just put it on a slow burn rather than extinguishing it. What I was ultimately arguing for was not apathy, but recognition that we have other forms of power. Power such as mutual aid, labor action, and community defense, all things that we are seeing right now in Minneapolis. We have power that can exist within our communities, rather than being delegated upwards to politicians or institutions who rarely share our material interests. So if people hear the phrase, real change doesn't happen in the voting booth, and interpret it as an argument for apathy, they're ultimately revealing how deeply institutions have shaped their political imagination. So many people in America see electoral politics as the only legitimate form of political agency. So much so that change and power doesn't feel real unless institutions validate it, which makes other, more fluid forms of holding power terrifying to them, or even inconceivable and recognizable as holding power. We've lost so many of our organizing spaces over the last few decades, like the factory floor, where we could see our shared struggles against racial, gendered, citizenship, sexual, and ableist divides. So we so rarely now get the chance to recognize our ability to organize and hold our own power anymore, outside of the spaces that are regulated for us by the state. And that fear that people have often gets turned into anger and redirected towards trans people, BIPOC communities, immigrants, disabled people, and numerous other marginalized groups who are often the first to recognize and point out explicitly that neither party in America is structurally designed to keep us safe in the first place. And that dynamic helps explain why support for LGBTQ rights has eroded here in America, even in blue states, and why misogynistic and ableist language has begun to creep back in, even into leftist rhetoric. I mean, I've been seeing the R slur all over the place, as well as why harassment keeps pushing trans people, women, and BIPOC out of many of these leftist spaces, despite many of them arguing that they're trying to stand up for trans people. It also warns the marginalized people who stay within these spaces to shut up, get in line, or you're going to be the next to be abandoned. And all of this happens because it's easier for people to feel a sense of control when they attack marginalized people that they have some level of power over who are raising uncomfortable truths, rather than confront how limited our political imaginations have become and how little we can do within the avenues that are presented to us as the only way that we can hold power. Our political imagination has narrowed so much that simply fighting back against anyone feels revolutionary, and we end up violently reinforcing the same hierarchies that we think we're fighting. All of this is ultimately the work of propaganda. Anarchism, which, generally speaking, is the belief that we do not need a state to hold power and can instead rely on a decentralized bottom-up approach to do so, has almost always been treated as uniquely dangerous to authoritarian regimes, especially when it gains real traction. At the turn of the 20th century in the United States, anarchists like Emma Goldman were gaining national popularity, not just by arguing for the abolition of the state, but because they were advocating for forms of community and individual autonomy that struck a chord at the foundations of American capital and social control. They organized around issues like birth control, labor issues, anti-militarism, and anti-draft politics during World War I, as well as the abolition of prisons. And these ideas were spreading among workers, immigrants, and racialized communities in the United States, and they helped fuel some of the most organized labor uprisings in the country, such as the 1892 Homestead Strike, which the government violently crushed with the Pennsylvania militia. Much of anarchist organizing led not only to labor action, but real community-based programs like Planned Parenthood, which was created by Margaret Sanger, who herself would go on to later hold deeply harmful views on eugenics, but whose work creating Planned Parenthood was heavily shaped by the rhetoric of contemporary anarchists like Emma Goldman, who was one of the first to frame birth control and women's health as a central working class issue that would give more power to the working class by enabling women not to be forced into motherhood and unpaid domestic labor. And this rising influence of decentralized community-held power politics began to spark a massive propaganda and legal crackdown campaign in the United States. It's ultimately why the FBI and people like J. Edgar Hoover began targeting those that they saw as labor organizers who they thought were radical movements going to tear down the United States government. It ultimately led to laws like the Immigration Act of 1903, which explicitly targeted anarchist ideology as a reason to exclude people from being able to immigrate to the United States, and also called for the deportation of any anarchists living in the United States that were non-citizens. This, by the way, is a very similar dynamic that we're seeing today, where many Palestinian activists are being targeted for deportment by the Trump administration. On top of that, World War I era anti-espionage legislation would often equate anarchism as an ideology with treason against the state during wartime, which ultimately gave the government sweeping surveillance and repression powers to use against anarchists. The American state didn't treat anarchism as a political philosophy that was welcomed within America's liberalist ideals of allowing anyone to speak their mind, but was instead framed as a contagious threat to the American state that needed to be quarantined and actively hunted down. And part of this propaganda campaign also helped to perpetuate one of the most persistent myths about anarchism, that anarchism is synonymous with chaos. Because without rigid power structures, surely society would just collapse into Mad Maxian-style chaos. We need institutions to make sure that we stay in line and care about each other.
Obligations only make sense in the context of persons, but not just any persons. There has to be one person who has the appropriate authority to issue commands. And in the same way, the theist wants to say, look, we have obligations. We have moral obligations because there is an appropriate authority that stands behind the moral commands that we discover in this universe. And the best explanation is that God is the appropriate authority. And so that's why moral obligations, the theist would argue, it only makes sense in the context of the existence of God.
Take Alfred Hitchcock's 1936 film Sabotage, which was a British film, but also reflective of many of the attitudes that were happening in America and Britain at the time. It was a movie that reduced anarchists to hollow, bomb-throwing conspirators rather than political thinkers with an active ideology. And it's led to more modern films like The Dark Knight Rises, a movie which borrowed imagery and rhetoric from the Occupy Wall Street movement in order to recast those ideals as simply nihilistic terrorism bent on the senseless destruction of an American city like Gotham.
We take Gotham from the corrupt, the rich, the oppressors of generations who have kept you down with myths of opportunity, and we give it back to you. the people. Gotham is yours. None shall interfere. Do as you please. But start by storming Blackgate and freeing the oppressed!
Hell, one of my favorite interviews with Christopher Nolan is where he mentions the fact that he finds anarchism to be terrifying, and it very much shows in his movies.
Particularly in the case of the Joker, it's an excitement about chaos and anarchy. But for me, those are very frightening things. The utter breakdown of society, the idea of complete anarchy, the idea of lawlessness, these are things that they have a very nightmarish quality for me.
As you can see, I portrayed you as a soyjack and me as a Chad, so I'm clearly the winner of this argument.
Thus, by portraying anarchism as simply nihilistic chaos, it makes any challenge to state power feel inherently dangerous, rather than something that can be politically imaginable. Because we are not allowed to think that any type of other society can possibly exist. Stories like Andor and One Battle After Another resonate because people are starting to recognize their own pain and becoming less complacent than the cultural systems designed to keep us passive would prefer. But those same systems are very, very good at absorbing that frustration and repackaging it into something safe by turning fascism into a singular villain we can defeat rather than a structure we have to dismantle. That's why Hollywood, which is increasingly being consolidated into a handful of megacorporations, sells revolution over and over and over again to us without hesitation, as long as those stories never offer a political vision that genuinely challenges neoliberal democracy's religious belief in the rule of law, nor the systems of exploitation of others. Instead, our stories that we are sold keep rebuilding the same systems, teaching us, secretly, what violence is acceptable, which lives are worthwhile, and which stories we treat as legitimate. Policing, immigration enforcement, militarized borders, endless war. Hollywood sanitizes them all and sells them back to us as order, security, and, most importantly, an inevitable human truth. It's why there's no contradiction in Amazon, Disney, or Warner Brothers selling anti-fascist art on the same platform as Melania Trump's documentary, or while they turn CBS News into Trump propaganda. Tony Gilroy even pointed out that when Andor Season 2 premiered, he was told by Disney that he wasn't allowed to openly relate the show to contemporary politics, especially American contemporary politics. Because for Disney, allowing the show to sit too openly within a contemporary political framework risked placing the company squarely in the Trump administration's crosshairs. An administration that has already shown very eager to frame critical media as hostile oppression and use that as justification for regulatory pressure and retaliation. But this is the game that Hollywood has been playing for decades. The industry isn't built to challenge dominant power so much as mirror it safely, because studios exist first and foremost to protect mega corporate interests. This is the long-term result of decades of American political policing of Hollywood, paired with the increasing financialization of film as the blockbuster era took over after Jaws and Star Wars. Once movies became billion-dollar franchise affairs rather than cultural artifacts that were telling earnest stories, it was all about minimizing risks and making stories that are framed as radical yet never actually challenge a dominant political power structure. They simply follow whatever cultural narrative generates profit in the moment. But either way, the capitalist foundations of power remain untouched, and exploitation along racial, gendered, and economic lines continues uninterrupted. Hollywood and the capitalist engines that sustain it keep returning to the same comforting reassurance that the system was always good. It just fell into the wrong hands for a while, without ever letting on that it never left theirs. Yet Star Wars Andor itself offers a fascinating representation of much more nuanced revolutionary debates around anarchism. At one point during Season 1, we see Saw Gerrera dismiss any of the other leftist groups fighting against the Empire because he sees them as still relying on authoritarian measures or compromising their values in order to restore the Republic.
Together. Krieger's a separatist. Maipei's a neo-Republican. The Goldman Front, the Partisan Alliance, sectorists, human cultists, galaxy petitionists, they're lost. All of them, lost!
But Luthen Rail, who is positioned in this show as a pragmatic revolutionary, dismisses Saw's anarchistic ideology as a luxury.
Well, anarchy is a seductive concept. A bit of a luxury, I'd argue, to a man who's hiding in cold caves.
And this discussion between Luthen and Gerrera actually mirrors very real historical conflicts and conversations within revolutionary imagination. While many Western states dismissed anarchism as a dangerous fantasy just on its face, many Marxist movements that were growing up around the turn of the century often framed anarchism instead as naive idealism. For example, one of the lead foundational writers of Marxism, Friedrich Engels, famously criticized anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, arguing in his famous essay on authority that revolution itself must be authoritarian because it requires imposing force to dismantle existing power structures and enforcing your will on the populace.
A revolution is certainly the most authoritarian thing there is. It is the act whereby one part of the population imposes its will upon the other part by means of rifles, bayonets, and cannon.
Building up upon this, during the Russian Revolution, Lenin himself excluded anarchists from joining workers' councils, believing their rejection of centralized authority would weaken the revolutionary struggle. And as the Russian state became more centralized under Joseph Stalin, anarchists who spoke out against this, such as Viktor Serge, who had fought for the Bolsheviks during the revolution, were eventually arrested and forced to live in exile. Leftist discourse often frames anarchism as a utopian indulgence, something only a decadent West could imagine, while elevating Marxism as the serious, realistic path forward, one that requires a level of force and authoritarianism in order to ensure comes into being. And yet, personally, I would argue that this framing represents another failure of revolutionary imagination. Because historically, as we see within revolution, much of this logic often reproduces the very hierarchies that it promised to dismantle. For example, after the Russian Revolution, as the Bolsheviks were building up their new Marxist state, Lenin argued that a vanguard party would temporarily hold state power before ultimately transferring it to the working class, thereby creating the bottom-up democracy. But in practice, that transition never actually came. Instead, power began to be consolidated under Stalin's regime into a more centralized authoritarian state that was built on surveillance, repression, and endless temporary emergency measures that increased state control that were all justified through anti-fascist and anti-Western imperialist rhetoric. A mirror of how the United States itself would justify its own authoritarian expansions through Red Scare fear around the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And that repression by the Soviet Union frequently targeted political rivals through weaponizing the very hierarchies and biases that revolutionaries sought to dismantle. Take, for example, how Stalin's regime weaponized the fear of homosexuality, promoting conspiracy theories around it. To quote one of Stalin's secret police chiefs, Genrikh Yagoda, the supposed existence of, quote, counter-revolutionary fascist homosexual networks was used to justify arrests and purges of Stalin's political rivals within the Russian government that were seeking power to rule over others and each other. This led to, in 1934, Article 121, which recriminalized homosexuality within the Soviet Union, reframing queer identity as Western degeneracy tied to fascism, echoed within propagandistic slogans like, quote,
"Exterminate all homosexuals and fascism will vanish."
Meanwhile, movements were made to promote Russian women as needing to make more babies for the state, which resulted in more reproductive control over women's autonomy, all under nationalist propaganda and Marxist aesthetics. All of this ultimately reveals how revolutionary rhetoric can still just reinstall the same cultural hierarchies like patriarchy just under a shiny new state authority and be called liberation. And we still see the limits of this revolutionary imagination today. Many contemporary leftists here in the United States continue treating movements that seek decentralized community power as their ultimate goal as unserious, compared to movements that seek to create a centralized state authority that will enforce Marxist ideals, arguing that real change requires rallying behind authoritarian revolutionary movements in order to enact that change. Take YouTuber Second Thought, who argued this very thing.
The left is already on the back foot, and we have been for many, many years. This is why it's frankly absurd how much infighting goes on among the left. Social Democrats sniping at tankies for being authoritarian doesn't do the movement any good. Funnily enough, the label authoritarian is only ever applied to successful socialist projects. The ones that failed were somehow more pure. But the moment a new system takes steps to ensure the security of their people and their new project, they're labeled authoritarian. I think part of this is that there's a lack of understanding among Western self-professed leftists regarding what it actually takes to change the status quo across an entire country. Every revolution, including bourgeois revolutions like the American one, are authoritarian by default. Those in power will never give up their power without a struggle. They're not going to let you vote out the very system that benefits them.
Second Thought never really explains what he means by successful socialist projects. Instead, he leaves that part rather vague and instead argues that all revolutions are inherently authoritarian because they require imposing a new way of life onto others. But by doing that, he's flattening the crucial distinction between authoritarianism and community self-defense, as well as erases a long history of anti-imperialist and liberation movements that have used force not to dominate people, but to protect themselves, their movements, and ultimately their communities that they sought to build up. For example, when the Black Panthers armed themselves to defend black communities from police violence, that wasn't authoritarianism, that was self-defense. When the Zapatista's indigenous communities resisted the Mexican government, they weren't imposing top-down control and dictating to their communities how to run themselves, they were protecting a bottom-up, community-driven political project that still exists to this day. What Second Thought is ultimately trying to do here is defend centralized state projects like the Russian Revolution that concentrated power at the top and enforced it downwards, excusing authoritarian tactics used by governments like the Soviet Union or the CCP because they used those tactics to impose, at least aesthetically, communist ideals. And this mindset is what some call the anti-imperialism of fools, where geopolitics again gets treated like fandom. Hey look, it's that team sports ideology yet again. You pick a team, and suddenly everything outside your side gets a lore explanation, while the West gets framed as uniquely and inherently evil, and anarchism and decentralized power movements are just naive and idealistic. And aside on this, but shout out to the amazing YouTuber Politically Depressed who made a video on this topic as I was editing this, which I highly recommend if you're looking for a follow-up to this section of my video. And if it's not obvious by now, this unnuanced us versus them binary is a trap.
It's a trap!
God damn it, Akbar! Anyways, it's a trap. Because like how American conservatives mythologize the Confederacy in opposition to leftist authoritarianism, or how liberal politicians claim leftists are just as authoritarian as the fascist right simply for advocating for marginalized people's rights holistically, rather than compromising on them for the sake of civility politics.
You can't have absolutism on the left or the right without authoritarianism.
You can see how some authoritarian leftists mythologize Stalin as not that bad compared to American and Western authoritarianism and imperialism. And to think otherwise, they say, is just Western propaganda. And to be fair to them, they are absolutely correct that Western narratives have absolutely exaggerated and weaponized stories about authoritarian overreach of states like the Soviet Union and China, framing things like Stalin's gulags as uniquely communist evils, when modern American prisons are and were more authoritarian and operate on a scale far larger than the Soviet system ever did. But correcting that propaganda shouldn't then turn into defending the authoritarianism itself. It does not matter who cruelty is directed at, the cruelty itself is the point. Multiple things can be bad at the same time. And I've even seen this type of tension in creators that I genuinely admire. YouTuber Revolutionary Thought made a fantastic video about why the USSR recriminalized homosexuality that I highly recommend, that I drew from my earlier analysis in this video. But after spending the entire video doing a wonderful analysis of how the Soviet Union oppressed the queer community, she ends the video by emphasizing that the Nazis' prosecution of queer people was much worse.
Global rise of fascism and conservatism in the 1930s certainly didn't help queer people at all. So the Soviet Union was regressive in its criminalization of gay men, obviously, but certainly not unique.
Which is true, but by ending her video there, it helps to soften her critique of Soviet repression. Again, we see a similar dynamic of how anti-fascism is used to soften actual criticism of other systems. And to be absolutely clear here, because I know it will be taken and used out of context, I am absolutely not dragging Revolutionary Thought here, nor Second Thought for that matter. I think Revolutionary Thought especially is great. I occasionally disagree with her conclusions when she leans more state communist than my anarchist gremlin instincts ever want to be, but she's still worth engaging with, because I think her analysis is quite good, and because by engaging with people who disagree with me like that is how liberation movements grow, through disagreement and discussion, not ideological fan clubs screaming at each other across the internet. Ultimately, if we're going to be organizing against not just fascism, but the ways in which the liberal state fails our communities, we're going to be working with people who we don't always agree with leftists who believe in a centralized state, or, more likely oftentimes, liberals who just want to return to normalcy or believe in the system. The goal then should be to meet people where they're at, talk with them, and start to open up for them other ways that they can see the world can exist, rather than trying to force a way of seeing the world on them that they're just always going to reject regardless. It's a long process and it won't always work, but sometimes you can help reorient people away from neoliberal or state-centered thinking and toward something else. Have them think about the way the world can exist in new ways. But, and this is equally as important, that only works with people who are actually willing to organize with you, who show up and do the work alongside you. Big tent, quote-unquote, politics can't mean capitulating on your values, the way many institutional liberals often do, as they chase some mythical centrist voter and treat politics like a narrow slider within neoliberalism. The point is to build coalitions and structures that materially support and organize both with and for the most marginalized people in your community, not pressure them to acquiesce. To organize with those who actually show up in your community and want to help build it up, rather than force those living within it to exist a certain way. That's why I personally would rather organize with people like Revolutionary Thought or my friend Steve Shives, who is a self-professed reformist liberal, because even if I disagree with their ultimate end goals, they've shown me that they'll fight alongside me as a trans person. They uphold my humanity, push back against transphobia when they see it, and actually show up to do the work not just for trans people, but for all people. That willingness to do more than just say the right things, to actually put something on the line, matters more than teaming up with the loudest revolutionary leftist who talks about strength and authority while treating the most at-risk people like an afterthought. And you know the type that I'm talking about there. Believe me, there's a lot of them on YouTube alone. The thing that I have been circling around this entire video is that when your politics turns into simply opposing the villain of the moment and of your movement, whether it be Trump, Israel, America, Western imperialism itself, fascism, or colonialism, all things that are worth opposing, you stop asking how to dismantle the hierarchies underneath them all. I mean, personally, I believe this is why I've seen a huge rise in things like trans misogyny in leftist spaces online recently. That mirrors the same dismissive rhetoric I talked about earlier with how liberals treat trans people. I hear certain leftists continually using dog whistles around specific trans influencers supposedly being narcissistic, and even using hyperbolic rhetoric implying we deserve abandonment if we don't politically get in line with everyone else. This isn't to say that trans people or any marginalized people are immune from criticism. I have my own criticisms of many trans influencers, even within leftist spaces. But that to police that through dog whistles and reinforcing trans misogyny ultimately is going to be antithetical to your political project. I mean, to use a less loaded example than the one I know you're already all thinking of out there, I noticed this trans misogyny cropping up in leftist rhetoric when trans women were accused of supporting genocide if they voted for Kamala Harris, all while ignoring the material reality of that choice for many trans women and trans people generally. While many leftists, as I myself argued earlier, know that voting won't fundamentally change the American system and wish to make an understandably principled stand by refusing to vote for Harris in the face of her support of Israel, many trans people felt that they had to vote for her. But it wasn't because they supported her American imperialism, nor that we thought she was ever going to be a staunch defender for trans people, as we had already seen signs of her capitulating on trans issues during her campaign, but because it was a coerced survival decision shaped by the very real threat of escalating attacks against trans healthcare and our bodily autonomy that was being threatened by the possibility of a second Trump administration. Something we are now currently seeing unfolding, as the Lemkin Institute itself has even warned that the US is in the early to mid stages of a genocidal process that is targeting trans, non-binary, and intersex people. Many trans people, when they were voting for Harris, sadly didn't have the material ability to make that principled stand. But we were still harassed anyways, despite the rock and a hard place we were in, because we were not able to remain ideologically pure because the material reality of our gender class-based marginalization did not allow us to. with no leftists giving us the grace to recognize that we did not vote for our ideology, nor to abdicate our power or even change the system, but for the conditions that we wanted to organize under as trans people. Voting in a liberal democracy is simply choosing your preferred foe, not a champion of your ideals, as well as for the conditions you and those you are in solidarity with organize under. Because when people are just trying to survive under constant threat, it can breed anger and isolation, as we're currently seeing, which is not the kind of fertile ground organizing needs. And treating marginalized communities' concerns as secondary to your ideological purity always means sacrificing the people that are most exposed to state violence first. Ideology is important, your values are important, but there are also practical realities that you need to understand within that. If you actually want to fight the reality that many trans people felt forced into voting for Kamala just to try to preserve our access to basic healthcare, then maybe stop spending time shaming and harassing trans people for navigating a hostile system we didn't build and put that energy into building something real. Work within your communities to make sure trans people can get access to healthcare no matter who is in power, so that our survival isn't constantly held hostage by election cycles in the first place. Help organize or support community-run clinics that can provide trans healthcare and hormones even if the state tries to outlaw it. Creating, by the way, the same community structures that the Black Panthers did for those in their community. If you actually want people to stop believing the state is their only source of hope, if you want liberation for trans people and other marginalized communities to exist beyond consumable slogans and internet posturing, then that's the work you need to start contributing to. Not fantasizing about some glorious Marxist revolution that will one day summon you to pick up your gun and impose your ideology from the top down, but building the material networks of care and survival that make liberation possible right now in the communities where people are actually trying to live. And this is why, by the way, I highly recommend Revolutionary Thought's video, Are You Actually Revolutionary or Just Performative?, where she wonderfully breaks down how some leftist spaces, especially online recently, are reproducing the biases like homophobia, transphobia, racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, ableism, and many more, when tearing down those hierarchies is, the whole revolution part.
I am crashing out. What is up with some leftists calling any discussions about racism or misogyny or homophobia or ableism or any of the other forms of bigotry liberal identity politics, or saying that bringing it up divides the working class? Why are self-proclaimed leftists falling for right-wing culture war bull? It has come to my attention that many online leftists don't seem to understand the entire point of their own ideology, or else they'd at least question some of these talking points. Like, some online leftists really seem to treat being a leftist as a method of self-validation or a performance that makes them feel like the smartest, most correct, and specialist boy. And I say boy because this mostly applies to men, though women and non-binary people are definitely not immune, rather than as a set of guiding principles for how you interact with people, yourself, the world at large, and how you strive to change the world based on your own skills, abilities, and material conditions. Like a real leftist should.
Because ultimately, the goal of leftist politics is not simply to eliminate capitalism and colonialism, but to break down the hierarchies that those systems are built upon. And if we don't do that, we just set ourselves up to recreate another structure just like them in the long run. In the words of Murray Bookchin, what passes for revolutionaryism, radicalism, and leftism today in much of American and Western thought would have been dismissed a generation or two ago as reformism and political opportunism. This ultimately is a result of, and brings us back to, the core issue that I've been talking about this whole video, the failure of our revolutionary imagination itself. We continually struggle to imagine liberation as something built through messy, decentralized community care, instead defaulting to top-down struggles for power because hierarchy feels familiar and structurally normal. Living in a pressure cooker of exploitation means we never learn to imagine any other way to live. We start to believe that our chronic pain is normal, that we only need to shove the fascist thug off our broken leg and then return to the same hospital blanket of comfort, one that slowly smothers us while it crushes Black, Brown, Indigenous, Arab, Jewish, queer, trans, disabled, and other marginalized communities first. When, in truth, our pain is actually curable, but only through constant effort and care. Because ultimately, The historical touchstones for the Empire in Andor aren't singular, and they aren't confined to one ideology, even if the Empire itself is very overtly fascist-coded. The Nazis are the clearest reference point for the Empire, but the Empire is just as much shaped by British and American colonial power, right down to its casting choices, with most Imperial officers played by British actors, including everyone's favorite cape-wearing menace Ben Mendelsohn. And at the same time, Andor itself pulls from authoritarian systems often associated with the political left. The ISB evokes not only the CIA, but the Soviet KGB, and the Narkina 5 prison arc reflects multiple histories at once, echoing the for-profit prison labor system in the United States, Nazi forced labor camps, and Stalin's gulags. The Empire is deliberately built as an amalgamation of fascist, colonial, capitalist, and so-called communist modes of domination. The Empire isn't one thing, because authoritarianism never is. And this is why reforming liberal institutions built on capitalism, including cultural ones like Hollywood, will inevitably return us to the same place, whether it be in 4 years or 40. Or if we seek a revolution that demands that we try to create another state-enforced power structure without dismantling the biases and assumptions that many of those state-centralized power structures are built upon, will ultimately bring us right back here as well. All of these systems are run on some form of racial hierarchy and patriarchy. And reform doesn't dismantle them, it stabilizes them. And the result isn't liberation, but the careful reconstruction of exploitation. So normally, in years past, I probably would have ended this video there. But I don't want to end my videos on thing bad anymore, because to do that would be falling into the exact trap that I've been yelling about this entire video. The left is incredibly good at explaining what's broken. We're phenomenal at it. But like Hollywood, algorithms and media ecosystems like the one here on YouTube that I exist in feed on that anger. And it turns us into teams, as I said, creates an endless conflict, and it rarely encourages us to imagine what comes after. And so, we don't. We recommend policies in theory, but ultimately, many of our ideas are small, simply trying to fix or patch up a broken system. And even when we have big ideas, we find it hard to convince people that they're possible. But I personally think that the biggest failure of the left, broadly speaking, right now, isn't that we lack answers. In fact, it's arguable that we have too many of them. I think it's that we don't tell stories that make people want to live inside those answers. Which brings me to this wonderful book, The Dispossessed by Urusla K. LeGuin, which I love so deeply that I'm planning on getting a tattoo inspired by it. In fact, by the time this video comes out, I probably have already gotten it. And despite me loving this book for most of my life, I've avoided talking about it for most of my time on this YouTube channel, even when I've talked about LeGuin, and I've only recently begun to understand why. It's because this book captures so much of how I see the world, and shaped my entire thinking of life in many ways. And it reflects so much of what all of my art and my writing that I've done over the years has been reaching towards since I began creating. And so, how do you write about a book like that when your life's work is an attempt to give voice to the same ineffable feelings that this book is getting at? But that very feeling of reaching for a world that we know in our hearts, but struggle to articulate, while also fighting just to keep our hearts from hardening under the weight of power and trauma that are trying to kill them, is what The Dispossessed is all about. Urusla K. LeGuin, herself an anarchist, wrote The Dispossessed to articulate what so much of fiction made in an industrial capitalist complex like Hollywood will never let us imagine without portraying it as inherently dangerous or comedic or naive. A world built on the fundamental belief that humans can build a society beyond our human-generated hierarchies of gender, race, sexuality, and private property.
This was the late 60s. People were asking, what might a perfect society look like? A society that was not based on oppression. And thinking about that question brought me to nonviolent anarchism. I think anarchist thinking is one of those profoundly radical ways of thinking that is very fruitful, very generative. The more I read in anarchism, the more I realized that it was the only major political theory that hadn't had a utopia written about it. And I thought, well, that would be fun. That would be cool, you know. Then I could kind of begin figuring out what would a genuine working anarchist society be like.
And what's so great about The Dispossessed is that while it is incredibly romantic about the beliefs and hopes of a supposed anarchist society, it's not naive to the reality of the human condition. The novel follows Shevik, a physicist from Anaris, a moon that was settled by anarchists who were exiled from the wealthy hierarchical planet of Urus, which this moon orbits. Anaris has no formal government, money, prisons, or private property. In fact, social norms discourage accumulating personal possessions outside of sentimental value, and the culture resists any sort of social hierarchy at all. Women hold equal social standing to men in the society, and while we hear mention of people with different skin colors, that never becomes a basis upon which people discriminate within Anaris. On top of that, raising children is treated as a shared community responsibility rather than something tied to biology alone or left just to women. The community itself organizes work cooperatively, rotating people through necessary jobs like farming or mining as part of their shared responsibility to one another and to their community. And beyond that collective responsibility, people are generally free to pursue their own passions, recognizing that community enables that freedom. And yet, at the same time, Anaris is not a utopian paradise. Anaris is a resource-deprived moon where famine is not rare, and when it comes, which is often, people must work relentlessly to survive, collectively scraping a living from an unforgiving world. This forces people to be assigned into many menial jobs a lot of the time because people just need to get food and they have to put aside their own pursuits in order to do so. In a bitter irony, all of this forces Anaris to remain dependent on trade with Urus for what it cannot produce itself, being dependent on the very capitalist society that forced them into exile into these harsh conditions in the first place. The people of Anaris also live with the constant fear that Urus will one day arrive in force, no longer willing to tolerate such a visible symbol of defiance to the hierarchy hanging in the sky above their very planet, watched by every citizen every night. The Anaresti fear that they will become proof that another world is possible, a symbol for the underclass of a hierarchical society below them, because that society has to snuff out dreams like theirs in order to maintain the illusion of inevitability. But beyond all of its material hardships, the people of Anaris are not ideological clones either. People are more collectivist for sure, just on a cultural level, but they are still individuals, and individuals bring their own idiosyncrasies, prejudices, and flaws. Bureaucratic structures, for example, even in the absence of a centralized state, begin to form up on Anaris and start to limit possibilities despite the society's best actions. For example, the book features a storyline where Shevik gets screwed over by Sabul, an academic gatekeeper bureaucrat who has the ability to control scientific communication with Urus. And he uses this position of nominal power to take co-credit for Shevik's groundbreaking physics work. And through stories like this, we're repeatedly shown that this supposed anarchist utopia still has ways in which people take advantage over one another. But despite this, Shevik can't express his frustration and anger at Sabul's actions, because Anaresti society would likely shame his desire for credit on his paper as being egotistic. Despite its cultural celebration of pluralism, Anaris still pressures people to conform. Innovation, even in art, is discouraged when it disrupts Anaresti norms. For example, an artist named Turin writes a play that is critical of Anaresti social norms, and his peers ostracize him to the point where he ends up in a mental hospital. The Dispossessed ultimately is showing how the seeds of old worlds, old patterns of control and domination still leak into a society that is trying to free itself of them.
We fear being outcast, being called lazy, dysfunctional, egoizing. We fear our neighbor's opinion more than we respect our own freedom of choice. You don't believe me, Tuck, but try. Just try stepping over the line. Just in imagination, and see how you feel. You realize then what Terran is and why he's a wreck, a lost soul. He is a criminal. We have created crime, just as the Proprietarians did. We force a man outside the sphere of our approval and then condemn him for it. We've made laws of conventional behavior, built walls all around ourselves, and we can't see them because they're part of our thinking.
LeGuin doesn't present a society based on decentralized community power as somehow being an inherent perfect utopia just based on the fact that it is that type of society alone. She presents that society as a living process, something that is fragile, imperfect, constantly needing renewal through self-critique and collective care. Yet what I love about the Dispossessed is that Inaris reflects real-life movements like Rojava and the Zapatistas, and how they've tried to build decentralized governance through the centering of women and other marginalized voices and distributing resources through mutual aid and building community-based governmental structures, all while surviving relentless military, economic, and political pressures and fighting their own internal struggles at the same time. For example, groups like the Black Panthers or projects like Rojava did not magically eliminate misogyny, racism, or internal prejudice within their movements overnight, or at all. These tensions still surfaced regularly, sometimes painfully, because liberation movements are made of people, and people drag the baggage of the world they're trying to dismantle right in with them.
Throughout 20th century revolutions, women's issues were always told to wait. Socialists said that communism must be achieved before women can be free, and pushed women to the back burner. Anarchists in Spain were challenged by Mujeres Libres, an organization of anarchist women who refused to be forgotten or pushed aside, despite the substanceless lip service of the most anarchist men. Women in Rojava aren't only fighting against horrifically patriarchal militants like the Islamic State or the Salafist mercenaries backed by the Turkish state. They are fighting against the patriarchal mindset that has dominated the very societies in which they live for thousands of years, and which has even been infused into their own thought patterns. Women were the first colony, and all oppression stems from the first oppression of women. If women aren't free, society cannot be free.
We can also see this in Western anarchist movements, like during Occupy Wall Street, how participants of color repeatedly pointed out that organizers pushed them into visible leadership roles as diversity optics while sidelining or dismissing their actual political concerns. Anarchists are not somehow morally purified just because we argue for decentralized power. Decentralization doesn't automatically delete our biases, it just removes the convenient excuse of blaming everything on one bad boss that we need to defeat. If anything, it forces movements to confront these contradictions directly and look at where they actually come from and deal with them in messy, uncomfortable ways. And that's kind of the point. These communities are not utopias, but they are evidence that alternative ways of living can be built even while under constant threat. That we don't have to justify authoritarianism or relying on the old ways of living just so we can survive. All this being said, it's worth noting that anarchists can also fall into team politics too. We're not immune to romanticizing other liberation movements or flattening them into an inspirational mythology, just as any other type of ideology can. For example, Western anarchists especially have a habit of talking like we invented ideas like direct democracy or social ecology, when many indigenous communities across the world have been practicing forms of collective governance for centuries. By doing that, we ultimately recreate a Western-centered hierarchy. Yet at the same time, as we recognize that indigenous societies have been doing this as well, we need to make sure that we don't turn indigenous cultures built on decentralized community building into mystical alternatives to modern Western life. It's about recognizing these societies as living historical and ongoing realities. It means also expanding whose voices we treat as foundational to much of anarchist thought. Not just Western theorists like Bookchin, as much as I love him, but also organizers, thinkers, and storytellings from many of these indigenous communities themselves. Yet, her book at the same time also rejects the idea that anarchism is just nostalgia for some pre-industrial past that humanity can never return to. Instead, she argues for and shows us a future that we can fight for. And I want to be very clear and admit that I'm just offering a narrative here, a big idea, a story that we can organize around. But that story needs to be accompanied by actual knowledge of how to build actual movements like this, lest we remain in the realm of purely ideal fiction. It's why I would strongly recommend reading Practicing Social Ecology by Eleanor Finley and Let This Radicalize You by Kelly Hayes and Mariam Kaiba. Both of those books are amazing, reader-friendly entry points to understanding what decentralized direct democracies can actually look like, both in theory and practice, and the pitfalls that it can fall into. Or you can look at reporting by those like Margaret Killjoy out of Minneapolis right now to see how Minnesotans are doing community-centered organizing in real time as they fight back against ICE. But most importantly, I want to tell you to start practicing it yourself. Start small. Go out and join anti-ICE actions in your city, or organize a block party to get to know your neighbors, and at that party, ask them about their needs and what they're struggling with right now, and see if there are ways that you can organize together. Find ways to build community. And yet, we do also have to recognize how fragile these projects can be. In January of 2026, the Syrian government launched a renewed offensive against Rojava. These assaults displaced tens of thousands of people, and in part because the United States withdrew its support, large portions of Rojava were forcibly folded back into a centralized Syrian state government, undermining the bottom-up governance structures communities there had spent years building. Because sometimes revolution is as fragile as a hospital built in a war zone. Maybe that hospital only stands for a few months before it's bombed or abandoned or overtaken. But for the people who were treated there, for the doctors who worked there, and for the community that survived because of it, it left proof that care could exist amid destruction. That even if something is impermanent, it is still worth doing. This isn't to say we don't fight to preserve them. There are still fighters today in Palestine, in Rojava, in Minneapolis, and we should continue to fight for them and alongside them. But knowing they are fragile and may not last forever means that we should fight all the harder. And it means, even if they fall, they were still worth fighting for every second that they did exist. All of this is why dismissing anarchism as too utopian narrows what we believe can exist. Every dominant ideology sells its own unreachable paradise, its own utopia, promising that it will exist forever, that it will be the end of history once we reach it. Nation-states present themselves as permanent by endlessly mythologizing their own power, constructing a version of time that loops back on itself endlessly, insisting that this is the only world that has ever been or ever will be. Fascism promises a return to a mythologized past that never actually existed. Capitalism sells us a frictionless future of endless growth, all wrapped today in an aesthetic of Star Trek and a liberal framework of universal equality, while actually building the foundations for the techno-feudalist dystopia of The Expanse. Even communist states imagine a final perfected Marxist society. And these stories teach us that imagining life beyond hierarchy, beyond these dreams, is naive or impossible. They tell us it's easier to find a nice, safe hierarchy and settle in. Easier to let yourself be governed than to choose a struggle that will never truly end. And while I believe that stories will never cause change in and of themselves, they do shape what we believe change looks like and the futures we learn to desire. That's why art is so controlled and sanitized by institutions built on exploitation, capitalism, colonialism, and empire. They tell us resistance runs on hatred and anger or revenge, and that power can only exist as power over others. And they shrink the range of futures we are allowed to dream. But they misunderstand where revolution actually lives. And because of that, they can never fully extinguish it. Revolution lives in our stubborn human instinct to care for one another. You see it in Minneapolis today, every time a neighbor walks a child to school or defends their community against ICE thugs. You see it in Gaza, in the fight against Israel, and in the loving work of Palestinians preserving their culture and caring for each other against overwhelming odds. You see it in Rojava as people fight to protect the autonomy that is currently being taken from them by the Syrian government. You see it in your very own neighborhood in any moment that someone chooses to go out and meet someone else and ask them how they're doing. Humans endlessly choose the power to care for each other, not the power to dominate. Revolution isn't simply fighting authoritarianism, it's choosing each other. It's recognizing that community includes anyone struggling towards a more livable world. Anarchism does have a utopia, but it is an ever-evolving one. It's the one that is in our hearts that never crystallizes into one thing, but is constantly changing with the needs of those around us and ourselves. And it exists in the moments when communities choose to build something different together. As LeGuin says,
"You cannot buy the revolution. You cannot make the revolution. You can only be the revolution. It is in your spirit, or it is nowhere."
These moments remind us that nothing lasts forever, and it's that very impermanence that proves another world can exist. A world we may never arrive at, but one we must walk towards still. We must choose to walk away from Omilaws, but we must always be walking towards something, not just away from something. We may not all walk towards the same future, because no heart is the same, but we can carry each other as we walk towards our shared horizons. As the Zapatistas say, we fight for
one world where many worlds fit.
On Anaris, Shevik suffers deeply. He sees the failures of his society clearly and still believes in its dream. Because utopia isn't about perfection, it's about direction. We have to be able to imagine it before we can ever reach towards it. And so in the novel, Shevek leaves Anaris and travels to Urus to work on his dream of faster-than-light travel, something he believes could connect the isolated worlds around the galaxy. But on Urus, he finds himself caught between two rival nations. Thu, a Soviet Union-like authoritarian socialist state that insists on Shevek's patronage because it seemingly shares leftist ideals with Anaris, and Io, a capitalist system built on liberal democracy that showers Shevek with comfort and prestige in order to ingratiate him with them. Both these states want his FTL work so they can use it to go out and rule the stars rather than explore them. Both sides want his work. Neither wants what he wants, as Shevek tells a scientist from Thu.
You know what I want, Chifolisk. I want my people to come out of exile. I came here because I don't think you want that in Thu. You are afraid of us there. You fear we might bring back the revolution, the old one, the real one. The revolution for justice which you began and then stopped halfway. Here in Alo, they fear me less because they have forgotten the revolution. They don't believe in it anymore. They think that if people have enough things, they will be content to live in prison. But I will not believe in that. I want the walls down. I want solidarity, human solidarity. I want free exchange between Urus and Anaris. I worked for it as I could on Anaris, and now I work for it as I can on Urus. We are brothers. We are brothers in what we share, in pain, which each of us must suffer alone, in hunger, in poverty, in hope. We know our brotherhood. We know it because we have had to learn it. We know that there is no help for us but from one another. That no hand will save us if we do not reach out our hand. And the hand that you reach out is empty, as is mine. You have nothing. You possess nothing. You own nothing. You are free. All you have is what you are and what you give.
Emma Goldman, after the United States deported her for her dangerous anarchistic ideals, traveled to Soviet Russia, hoping to witness a community-based world that she had always dreamed was possible, only to be devastated by the authoritarianism that she found there after the Russian Revolution. So, she ultimately walked away from both versions of Omilaz and spent the rest of her life fighting for a freer world that she never got to see.
It cannot be sufficiently emphasized that revolution is in vain unless inspired by its ultimate ideal. Revolutionary methods must be in tune with revolutionary aims. The means used to further the revolution must harmonize with its purposes. Revolution is the mirror of the coming day. It is the child that is to be the man of tomorrow.
Shevek himself carries the same ache as Emma Goldman. He knows that Anaris isn't perfect, he suffers under it, he's exiled from it, and he still believes in its possibility all the same. He understands that authoritarian socialist states fear anarchism not because it's unrealistic, but because it reminds them of what their revolutions once promised before power hardened around them. And he knows that capitalist democracies fear anarchism because it replaces ownership with trust and comfort with responsibility. Shevek doesn't believe freedom means escaping power forever. He believes freedom is choosing again and again to meet each other with care instead of control. To recognize that we are all struggling to survive, to understand ourselves, to be seen as fully human inside bodies that sometimes feel like cages. And that stubborn refusal to stop imagining each other free is what makes his hope feel so painfully, beautifully real. Which finally brings me back to Andor. Because Tony Gilroy is right, Andor isn't leftist or conservative, but it is more than anti-authoritarianism. I lied before. I do think Andor shows true revolution. We see it on the world of Ferrix, a community where workers place their gloves on a public wall because property is secondary to trust. And when someone dies on Ferrix, their ashes are turned into bricks that literally become part of the town's foundation. History and community aren't something Ferrix returns to, but something they stand on together. It lives in the present and shapes the future they build side by side, together. And when the people of Ferrix rise up against the Empire, it's not just to fight fascism, but to protect their community. Right under Disney's nose, Ferrix is an anarchistic, revolutionary world. Not because it declares a political team or fights authoritarianism, but because it centers care, trust, and shared responsibility over hierarchy. And that's why the Empire destroys it. But Ferrix survives in the unfinished work of people who keep rebuilding community even knowing that it may fall again. Because revolution is never about a final victory or a permanent state. It is the heartbeat that constantly returns, reminding us we are never done learning how to live together. Hey, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope it was enjoyable and fun in some ways, probably less so in others, and at the very least educational and hopeful, which is what I try to do with all of my videos, and I really appreciate you taking the time to watch it. That said, to wrap us out, I want to do a little personal and channel update here. I'll try and keep it short and not too woe is me territory, because I think we're all feeling that at the moment. But I did just want to share a few things about this video and where I'm at and things going forward for me, because it's been a little rough here. Being very frank, this video was a pain in the ass on a few different levels. The first and most obvious of which is that this video was actually supposed to come out last month. My goal was to actually try and get it out before the Oscars, because I kind of assumed that One Battle After Another was likely going to win Best Picture, and I kind of wanted to ride that algorithm wave, and everything was set for that to happen. But unfortunately, my editor, who I've been working with for many, many years, without going too much into their own personal stuff, essentially said that they were going to edit the video, had it for several weeks, and I even paid them up front for part of the job, as I normally do with them, and they turned out to have done none of it, and then ghosted me right when I was sort of asking for them to deliver the final product that they had said they basically had done, which was really, really shitty and awful. And I want to shout out to Eleanor, who ended up editing this video last minute on top of working on her own stuff. She did an amazing job, so thank you to her. But unfortunately, it did mean that this video is now a month late and likely will not do great in the algorithm. So thank you again for watching this video. But that has been one rough thing going on here. And again, I don't want to fall too much into woe is me, but I'm going to be very frank, and I've mentioned this in a few other videos, but I am not doing really great right now, personally. There's very obvious world stuff going on that is a big contributor to that, as well as some personal stuff that I don't really want to get into at the moment, but it's just not been great. And I've also been kind of learning about myself with my therapist that I have not been being very kind to myself mentally during the midst of all of that. And what that means professionally is that I've been finding it very difficult to write through all of that. And I've also, when I've not been able to write, not been very kind to myself as a result of that. And that's not really a good way to foster creativity. And then on top of that, I've just been experiencing, kind of in conjunction with that, a shit ton of burnout that's just affected both professional stuff and personal stuff. Again, I don't want to fall too into woe is me. I'm working through it. It'll be okay. But it's just been a rough time right now. And I say all that to say, and sorry that this is somewhat cynical, and I do apologize. I'm trying not to have it be woe is me, but what I do want to say is that throughout all of this, the way I'm able to support myself and pay my bills is through Patreon. And again, I hate to do the, like, support me on Patreon because I need to pay my bills, but, like, unfortunately, it's, like, literally one of my least favorite things to do as part of this job, even though it is a necessary and very important part of making this job sustainable. But here I am, I gotta do it. So I just want to reiterate, if you can support me or any creator, but me, who is acting right now, it really does mean a lot, especially right now, because it is a difficult time, I know, for many of us. And supporting us on Patreon is a way that we can at least have some sense of sustainability and stability, especially during a very unstable time at the moment, especially on YouTube. And that stability that all of my patrons have given me has been at least one thing that has carried me through a little bit through all of the rough patches here. So again, sorry that this is a cynical, please support me on Patreon thing. It's something I don't really like to do, but I'm trying to be less mean to myself about doing it. So here I am, just explaining where I'm at in the world, and I am trying to work on some really cool stuff. I do have other projects both on YouTube and outside of YouTube that I am working on, so, you know, I'm just trying to find a way to do that in a way that's healthy and sustainable and good for my mental health, while also feeling creative and generative right now. So working on it, and it's still something I'm excited and enthusiastic about doing. I love doing this job. It just is not fun to do this job in the world we live in. the moment, and I'll leave it there. All that being said, thank you all for supporting me. Thank you for watching this, and I hope you all, my friends, live long and prosper. Alrighty, it's time for me to thank my Patreons. I'm gonna sing the name of folks who supported me at the level to get the name sung. Don't know what this song is, but here we go. Carrie Ellen Foss, 9 and Blue, Ricky Strong, MRK, Ruger, Barbie and Rounds, River Champion, Sarah Montgomery, Veronica Fox, Illumi, Angie Vinco, Stephen Kleinard, Christian Hurst, Jasmine, Randy Thompson, Sarah Frost, Nova, Angela Hendricks, Rural Lefty, Rose Conley, Spooky Heather, Vincent Ellington, Anti-Kate 808, Tara Rose, Sarah Apparagus, Super Desi 01, Monty Workman, Meta Whisperer, Sammy Joe Retro, Zane Schuschler, David Demma, Gordon Alexander, Swiss Woke, Cad Kitten, Cleo McKeever, Gula from Balua, the Gnome, Joseph Dewey, Chris Showers, Lily Gray, James Krivda, Katie Starr, Todd Verling, Kizia Garrett Smithson, Richard Gordizzi, Daihatchi, Dominic Noble, Mountain Snow, Farangato, Bon, Ryan Hunter, Patrick Green, Digital Beef, W, Randy Edie, Kevin Frontag, Fly and Keita, Gomandur Stephenson, Sean Sullivan, Daryl Williams, Sandifer, Jamie, Casey Kyle Hampton, Lordra, Teague Wilson, Craig and David, Meat Popsicle, Andrea Popvik, Steven Richardson, Omar Morales, Atheistic Snail, Alexa Burris, Kara the Neuroturtle, Link PT, Erica Barrica, Patricia Cromptive, Jason Knott, Kurt Mullen, Devin Kamelocker, Alba, Zach Prax, Liz Palmwell, Damian Rice, Sean Brannon, Shalia Wolfie, Tyler Edwards, Carlo Flores, Nathan Wilsey, Jordy Lucero, Laura Demereau, Crit Fax, Fan, Breadborn, Half-Educated, Delianite, Sarah Lamoureux, Rosalinda Bannington, White Lion, Krista L. Mogul, Sophia's Left Florida, Alec Library, Nacy Moonrow, Melody Ann Wintersgood, Michael Weber, Maximilian Marks, Henry Pierce, King Lee, Matt Buck, Anon McAnon Face. Alright, hopefully any of that made sense to all of you, but thank you all for the support. It means a lot, especially right now.